broadcast.
The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome. My name is Joshua Cunningham, Chief of the Advanced Clean Cars Light-Duty Vehicle Regulatory Programs. I want to welcome you all to our public workshop on the Advanced Clean Cars 2 rulemaking. One benefit I'll note of this virtual setting is the ability to have a much wider set of attendees. We're excited about having a large engagement today and hope that you find the information that we present today useful. In a minute, I'm going to turn it over to Belinda Chen to begin the presentation and kick off the event, but I think we're going to wait for just another minute to make sure we're maximizing everybody joining. So bear with us for another second or so.
All right, good morning, everyone, or afternoon, evening. I'm not sure where you are, but this is the May 6th Advanced Clean Cars 2 workshop. My name is Belinda Chen. I'm one of the staff in the Advanced Clean Cars branch, and I'm coordinating this rulemaking package. So I'm just going to start with some logistics for today. This is a 4-hour workshop, which we know is quite long, but don't worry. If you have to step away for portions of it, it will be recorded and the recording will be posted. So you can always catch up on it later. The slides we are presenting today are available for download. I know there was a little bit of a glitch with certain browsers. So if you tried to download earlier, the slides should be available now using all browsers. And you could also, if it's still not working, check with a different browser. And there are also a few other documents that you can download that provide additional detail on some of the proposals that we're sharing today. And just to note that these are only available for download through this GoToWebinar control pane while the webinar is running. So I would encourage you to download these now. Of course, we will post them later to our website, but that process takes a few days. And this recording of, well, like I said before, will be posted there too. And if you're subscribed to our mailing list, you will receive an announcement when all these materials are available on our website. As for questions, there will be breaks throughout for questions. Please use the question box that's shown on the screen. For asking your questions, please don't raise your hand because we are keeping all attendees muted for the whole webinar. And we'll try to get to as many questions as possible, but if we don't get to yours during the webinar, please email them to cleancars@arb.ca.gov. And if you're watching the recording of the webinar and would like to ask a question, you can send an email to that same address. In all cases, please refer to slide numbers in your question when possible. And we want to acknowledge up front that this is a long workshop and that we're presenting technical information today. So if you'd like to discuss this rulemaking with us in any more detail after the workshop, please don't hesitate to reach out to us using this Clean Cars email. So starting with a quick refresher, as we showed at our last workshop in September, the red wedges in these two pie charts represent the light-duty sector's contribution to California's greenhouse gas, or GHG, and nitrogen oxide, or NOx, emissions. The recently released mobile source strategy and the upcoming scoping plan update indicate that deep emission reductions will be needed from all sectors to meet the state's carbon neutrality targets by 2045, and for South Coast to meet the 2031 and 2037 ozone standards. And while not shown here, further reductions in particulate matter emissions from the light-duty vehicles will be necessary for the San Joaquin Valley's attainment for PM standards. All of these emission reductions are necessary for improving air quality for all Californians, but especially those who live and work in communities that are disproportionately impacted by air pollution. Today, we'll be sharing our proposals for further reducing smog-forming emissions from future conventional vehicles, as well as increasing the share of new zero-emission vehicles, or ZEVs, sold, and ensuring that a ZEV can be a full replacement vehicle for not just the first owner of that vehicle, but also its subsequent owners. Of course, this transition to electrification will not be free, and you will hear an update on our cost estimates for these ZEV technologies. We have also begun meeting regularly with advocacy organizations and community groups to gather feedback on ways to increase ZEV accessibility to priority communities, and hope we can share some details on those proposals at our next workshop. Electrifying all passenger vehicles so that they can substantially contribute to meeting our long-term air quality and climate targets will mean transitioning the fleet to one that is predominantly battery electric and fuel cell electric vehicles, with plug-in hybrids still playing a role. As shown in this updated well-to-wheel emissions analysis done for the draft mobile source strategy, these three technologies all have lower emissions in the near and long term as compared to conventional gasoline vehicles, even as those vehicles meet more stringent tailpipe standards. However, as you will hear later in the presentation, future plug-in hybrids will need to be both cleaner and more advanced than the ones that you see in showrooms today. And given the greater uncertainty surrounding their emission benefits, as well as the limited supply of liquid biofuels that will be available in the future, the degree to which plug-in hybrids can be used for this transition will be constrained. Nevertheless, we believe that all three technology types will be necessary to achieve the governor's goal of 100% ZEV sales by 2035 that was announced shortly after our last workshop. In that executive order, he directed CARB to set regulations toward meeting this goal, and you will hear more about those proposals later in this presentation. So we'll start today with updates to our low emission vehicle criteria pollutant proposals. That will be followed by the proposed changes to the zero emission vehicle regulation. Then after a break around 11, we'll update you on our work on ZEV technology costs before moving on to updates on the ZEV assurance measures. And then we'll wrap up with our proposal for battery labeling to facilitate recycling and reuse. And we'll stop for questions again, like I said, after each of these before concluding with our next steps. So I'll now pass it on to Marco to start with our first item.
Thanks, Belinda. Good morning, everyone. I'm Marko Jeftich. I'm staff in the Sustainable Transportation and Communities Division. And today I will give an update on our criteria emission proposals for Advanced Clean Cars 2. This is an overview of the topics that we'll cover today. We will give an update on our planned changes to the NMOG plus NOx fleet average rules and SFTP emission standards. We'll go over several changes that aim to reduce cold start emissions, specifically regarding intermediate soaks, quick drive away, and PHEV high-powered cold starts. Then we'll give more details about our proposed revisions to rules for medium-duty vehicles and our evaporative emission standards. Today, we do not have an update for USO 6 PM standard changes, but we'll have that as a topic at a future workshop. At our previous workshop last fall, CARB staff described the challenges we are facing with the NMOG plus NOx fleet average beyond 2025. To recap, under the current program, there are annual fleet reductions down to 0.030 grams per mile in the 2025 model year. And beyond that, the fleet average remains flat. Since the fleet average includes ZEVs, this presents a challenge as we're expecting a large increase in ZEV sales beyond the 2025 model year. which leaves the door open for non-ZEVs to potentially get a lot dirtier. At our last workshop, we presented a couple of options on how to resolve this issue, and we saw feedback from stakeholders regarding whether we should continue to keep ZEVs in the fleet average, but continue to lower the average beyond 2025, or whether we should take the ZEVs out of the fleet average so that the non-ZEVs have to comply on their own. Based on the feedback we received from stakeholders, CARB is proposing to move forward with a non-ZEV fleet average beyond 2025. Overall, this option has slightly more support from stakeholders, and it provides more certainty and predictability regarding the future emissions from the non-ZEV fleet. CARB is aware that the non-ZEV fleet emissions will be above 0.030 grams per mile in 2025. And as such, we are continuing to consider the proper phase-in period to transition to a 0.030 gram per mile non-ZEV fleet average. Our current analysis indicates that a phase-in could be achieved over 2 model years, but we are continuing to gather data to ensure this will not create undue burdens, especially for automakers that have higher ZEV sales in 2025. Separately, staff are still evaluating whether it will be feasible to further lower the non-ZEV fleet average below 0.030 grams per mile. We are aware that cost effectiveness is a concern here, and it will be a guiding factor in making this decision as we gather more data and conduct analysis. Finally, we would like to acknowledge that several stakeholders suggested an alternative option to allow each automaker to choose whether to keep ZEVs in or take ZEVs out of the fleet average. But our internal analysis revealed that doing so would result in an emission impact, since we would expect that all the ZEV sale leaders would choose to keep ZEVs in and all the ZEV sale laggards would choose to take ZEVs out, and the combined emissions would be higher than the proposed option of taking ZEVs out. At the previous workshop, staff also indicated that changes to the emission certification bins were being considered. This slide shows the current bins that are available for certification. Based on further analysis and feedback from stakeholders that expressed general support for removing the highest emission certification bins, ACC2 is moving ahead with the proposal to eliminate the LEV 160 and ULEV 125 bins. While the exact dates for the phase-out of these bins have not been finalized yet, our plan is to remove the LEV 160 bin first, followed by a subsequent phase-out of the ULEV 125 bin, rather than having a simultaneous removal of both. In addition to removing the highest bins, stakeholder feedback also indicated support for adding new bins, especially at the lower end of the spectrum, as these changes will help with the transition to the non-ZEV fleet average and encourage automakers to certify vehicles to cleaner levels. Staff are considering a proposal that will add a new intermediate bin between each of the existing bins, as shown by the striped blocks. Furthermore, we are also considering adding 1 or 2 new bins below SULEV 20, either a SULEV 10 or SULEV 15, or both. As we continue to develop this proposal, we intend to work more closely with the EPA on these potential bin changes, as these modifications will work best if implemented in coordination between the agencies. Now let's move on to the NMOG plus NOx standards for aggressive driving. Under our current rules, almost all automakers certify their aggressive driving emissions using a composite method which combines the emission results from 3 different test cycles. We have the FTP cycle, which represents lower speed urban driving, the SCO3 test, which represents urban driving, but with the air conditioning turned on, and finally, the USO6 cycle, which represents driving with aggressive accelerations and freeway speeds. The emissions from these 3 tests are then weighted according to the fractions shown in the pie chart, and the composite value is calculated. The issue with this approach, as we can see in this graph, which shows an example for a SULEV 30 vehicle, is that it allows the aggressive driving cycle to have much higher emissions than the other 2 cycles. In the past, there were concerns that vehicles could have poor air-fuel ratio control during transitional operation that might occur during hard accelerations and could lead to higher emissions on the USO6 cycle. But modern vehicles generally have much more computing power and much better throttle and fuel injection control, and this is not a concern anymore. Therefore, our plan is to propose a transition that will require all vehicles to certify to standalone standards for each test cycle. Current regulations already have standalone standards in place, where each cycle is required to meet the emission levels shown by these black lines. But currently, this method is optional. Furthermore, the current standalone standards were based on LEV2 vehicles and only have 2 certification bins, one for all SULEVs and one for all ULEVs. And the new bins are needed to support a proposed transition to the standalone standards for ACC2. To gain more insight where to set the bins for standalone standards, CARB tested several 2017 to 2020 model year vehicles on the aggressive driving cycle. Here we can see the emission results of several SULEV 30 and ULEV 70 vehicles. Note that the emission values shown in this figure represent full useful life emission levels, since the lab test results were adjusted using the durability factors declared by automakers during certification. The full useful life emission results indicated that most vehicles were comfortably below the current standalone standards and would be able to meet standards that are numerically equivalent to the FTP standards, as shown by the black lines. These results were quite consistent with the certification data, which indicated that over 80% of the fleet would be able to meet these new standalone standards. Therefore, based on our analysis of the vehicle test results and certification data, our proposal will require all vehicles to meet standalone USO6 standards for NMOG plus NOx that are equivalent to the FTP certification bin of the vehicle. Next, I'm going to go through the changes we are proposing to ensure better control of cold start emissions. This is especially important since for light-duty gasoline, cold start emissions often represent the bulk of criteria exhaust emissions released during a trip. Our current rules only regulate cold start emissions that follow an overnight soak, where the vehicle is turned off for 12 hours or more, assuming that it represents the worst case emissions with a fully cold engine and catalyst. However, CARB's vehicle testing found that there were excess emissions for intermediate soaks, especially in the range of 30 minutes to 5 hours, as shown by the huge emission bump in the graph on the left. This emission bump can have a pretty significant effect on in-use emissions, since the data in the graph on the right shows that these intermediate soaks represent about 40 to 50% of in-use driving. CARB has already reached out to automakers regarding this issue, and most have already taken voluntary action to reduce these excess emissions. However, we still don't have any reg requirements to protect against this emission bump from occurring. Therefore, staff has been testing new vehicles that already have the voluntary fix in place to help gather data to develop a reg. For reference, here we see an example of a SULIF 30 vehicle with an older calibration, which has excess emissions above the SULIF 30 standard for intermediate soaks. All of the new vehicles that were tested have shown improved performance. For example, this 2020 Toyota Camry, shown by the yellow line, has been calibrated to eliminate the emission bump and to be under the emission standard at all soak times. This is a clear improvement compared to the red line, but it's not as good as what we're seeing from some of the other vehicles that we've tested, like this BMW SUV. Here we can see that the emissions consistently reduce as the soak time reduces. These lower emissions make sense since the engine, the combustion chamber, and the initial catalyst temperature are all warmer for shorter soaks, so engine out emissions can be lower and catalyst light off can be achieved earlier compared to longer soaks. So for ACC2, staff is working on a new requirement that will follow more closely with the BMW's performance, as shown by this green line. With this proposal, longer soaks, such as 3 hours or longer, would be required to meet emission levels no higher than the overnight soak standard. And for shorter soaks, in the range of 10 minutes to 3 hours, staff is working on a linearity requirement that will strive to gain an additional emission benefit, as shown by this additional shaded area. Staff believe the additional emission reductions will be cost-effective and can be achieved mostly by calibration changes. While the details are still being ironed out, the intent is for automakers to attest to meeting these new rules, rather than adding new strenuous test requirements at multiple soak points. Another cold start issue that CARB has been investigating concerns excess emissions that can occur when a real-world drive-away is quicker than those on lab test cycles. For reference, the cold start FTP test has an initial idle of 20 seconds. And at the previous workshop, CARB presented real-world data that indicated in-use driving tends to have much shorter initial idles. Since the last workshop, staff has continued to collect data and analyze in-use driving patterns, and an updated analysis is presented in this graph. The new data still indicated that a large share, over 60%, of in-use trips have a faster drive away than the FTP cycle, with the median time being around 14 seconds, and with 24% of trips having a drive away of 5 seconds or less. Additional in-use data analysis was shared by a few automakers, and although there were some variations, the data still suggested that there was a large share of in-use trips that had a quick drive away, with 25% being faster than 8 to 10 seconds. As such, staff are continuing to work on a proposal that will focus on controlling emissions from these quick drive-aways. To help develop a proposal, staff has continued testing vehicles as shown in this graph. Shown are results that compare emissions from the official FTP test that has a 20-second idle with a modified FTP test that has a quicker drive away of 5 seconds. On average, the emissions doubled when the idle was reduced to 5 seconds. But as we can see here, some vehicles performed better than others. Staff is continuing to test more vehicles and will continue to evaluate in-use driving data and analyze emission test results to determine an appropriate rule that will help control these excess cold start emissions. The data analysis will help determine whether developing a new standard based on the best performing vehicles or drafting calibration guidance language will provide more robust emission control for quick driveaways. There are also cold start issues that are unique to plug-in hybrid vehicles. PHEVs can start out driving in pure electric mode. Then, when they get to the freeway and accelerate hard, the ICE can turn on at the worst possible time during the high power demand, and there will be a huge spike in emissions. So to get an idea of the emission impact this high power cold start can cause, we tested a lot of PHEVs and compared emissions from the certification cycle, shown by the red bars in this graph, with emissions from various high power cold start cycles, shown by the striped yellow bars. For newer passenger cars, we can see that there are a lot of empty spaces compared to older 2013 models, which indicates that newer cars are trending towards stronger electric powertrains and are capable of driving fully electric without any emissions during these hard accelerations, as shown in these test results. But we can also see that when the engine does start under high power demand, the emissions for passenger cars are still higher than the certification cycle. However, when averaged out with the non-starts, the average emissions for cars are relatively close to their certification standard. On the other hand, the SUVs and minivans showed much higher emissions, and the engine starts occurred more frequently, since the electric powertrains were not capable enough to handle the extra vehicle weight. To help curb the excess emissions we are seeing from some of these heavier PHEVs, staff is working on a proposal that aims to limit these emission impacts. More specifically, staff is working on a new cold start US06 emission standard for PHEVs that will target emission reductions for NMOG plus NOx. The new standard would be based on the emission results of the best performers on the cold US06 cycle, as illustrated in this figure. The test data indicates that a standard of around 100 milligrams per mile could be set for a SULEV 30 PHEV. For reference, this is double the current hot US06 standalone standard. Staff envision this will be a cold bag standard, rather than a weighted average. Furthermore, PHEVs that are non-blended or US06 capable, meaning that they can drive the US06 cycle fully electric without using the gasoline engine, would be exempt from this requirement. As we continue to work on this and our other exhaust emission requirements, we encourage stakeholder engagement and we look forward to the feedback. I will now hand it over to Jason Gordon to go over our plans for evaporative emissions.
All right, thank you, Marco. I'm Jason Gordon, and I'll be going over the evaporative emissions portion of the proposal. The first part of the evaporative proposal involves tightening the running loss standard. So at the last workshop, we actually proposed changing this standard from 0.05 to 0.010 grams per mile. And then just as a recap, running loss emissions are the evaporative emissions which occur when the vehicle is actually driving, and it's primarily due to fuel vapors that escape the fuel system during driving. So yeah, at the last workshop, we proposed tightening the standard to 0.010. We did that based upon looking at certification data, which is shown here again, which shows that the vast majority of the vehicles are coming in below that proposal. But there are still a smaller proportion that are hybrid emitting. So our goal here is to eliminate the dirtier vehicles and ensure that good designs remain the norm. So since the last workshop, we did have some discussions with automakers, and they described to us that they would like to have a little bit more room for a little bit of flexibility, more flexibility in there to account for measurement variability during vehicle testing. So we took that feedback into account, and we have our latest proposal here, which has a little bit more flexibility in that we're proposing 0.01 grams per mile instead of 0.010 grams per mile. So basically what you have here is it's 2 places past the decimal place instead of 3. And then when you do the math on that, with rounding, that gives some more flexibility, as is shown in the chart here where we have the proposed standard. But rounding, but nominally, we expect that these vehicles will still be designed as clean. So now we can move to the next slide, please. This is actually a new proposal for this workshop, and it involves what we're calling puff emissions. So these are unique to the special sealed NERCOS gasoline tanks, which are common on plug-in hybrid vehicles, and you also see this on some of the standard hybrid vehicles as well. About 6% of the total vehicles in the California fleet have a fuel system like this, and we expect this to grow in the future as far as how many vehicles in the fleet have this. There's a specific sequence of driving on a hot day, and then followed by, if you do a refueling event, that can overwhelm the canister and create a puff of hydrocarbon emissions of vapors into the atmosphere. That's our concern. So basically what you can see here in this situation is the carbon canister in the vehicle would get a double dose of fuel vapors to it. First, when you, just before you do refueling, in order to vent the tank vapor to the canister. And then secondly, it gets another dose of vapors during the refueling process. So moving to the next slide. So the problem that we're trying to address here with this puff emission proposal is that the current test procedures don't capture this worst case event that I was just describing. And it could allow for undersized canisters on vehicles that could let vapors break through to the atmosphere during refueling. Based upon our initial estimate, about 80 to 90% of vehicles that have NERCOS fuel tanks, these sealed fuel tanks I'm talking about, do have a large enough canister. But there's some that appear to not have a large enough canister. Which brings me to our proposal for this, which is to specify minimum canister size in the regulation. So the car manufacturers would demonstrate compliance to this proposal using a car-defined model. It's basically an equation that you would input the vehicle-specific parameters into, and then that equation would output what the minimum canister size would be for that particular vehicle. I just want to point out, so as Belinda mentioned, there's some handouts that are attached to this webinar. One of those handouts deals with this, the puff equation. It details how this equation would be used, and then also how it was developed. And after folks get a chance to review that, we're happy to discuss that in the future if you have any questions or you know, if you have any questions on it. So we have a high degree of confidence that puff emissions will be accounted for using this new proposal without adding additional test burden. That's our goal. So that concludes things for the evaporative emissions portion of the proposal. So with that, I'll pass things on to Kevin Sophie for the next portion.
Sorry, just trying to share my webcam. There you go. Thank you, Jason. Hi, I'm Kevin Soti, and I will be covering the proposals for our heavier vehicles. First, I want to provide some background on medium-duty vehicles, or MDVs. As shown on the slide, medium-duty vehicles are in a weight category between light-duty vehicles and heavy-duty vehicles. Medium-duty is further split into two classes, Class 2B and 3. Class 2B encompasses the gross vehicle weight rating from 8,500 to 10,000 pounds, and Class 3 covers the weight rating from 10 to 14,000 pounds. Currently, there is some flexibility in certification and testing procedures for Class 3 MDVs, as they can be certified as whole vehicles using the light-duty chassis dynamometer test certification procedures, or as standalone engines using the heavy-duty engine dynamometer test procedures. The following proposals are intended to apply to MDVs that utilize the light-duty chassis test procedures. For reference, updated emission standards for the remaining MDVs using the heavy-duty engine procedures were already included as part of CARB's recent heavy-duty low NOx omnibus rulemaking. At our last workshop, we reported that we were exploring the effects of higher loads, such as full payload and towing on emissions for MDVs. In the graph shown on the right, we saw that the light-duty based chassis test cycle in pink triangles only covers a small range of the speeds and loads the engine is actually capable of. Compared to the heavy-duty engine test cycle, which is in dark blue circles, we see the heavy-duty based engine test cycle covers a much larger range of engine operation. To ensure good emission control in the areas of engine operation that are beyond what is covered by the current light-duty based chassis cycles, we were evaluating an in-use standard for chassis certified MDVs using portable emission monitoring systems known as PEMS, and the 3-bin moving average window method newly adopted for heavy-duty engines. In our next few slides, we will provide the results of our testing. The first step in our testing was to look at the types of engine operation covered by the chassis test cycles and by the on-road operation. This test data is an example of one of the diesel pickup trucks that we tested, and the graph shows engine speed and engine torque points during each test. The first dataset shows the individual points encountered during the current FTP certification test, which is run on the chassis dynamometer with the truck loaded to its half of its payload capacity. In the next test, we repeated the test but increased the load on the truck to full payload. As you can see, the engine operation shifts only very slightly to higher speeds. Next, we looked at the more aggressive and higher speed current USO 6 certification test, which is conducted at half payload. Directionally, we see some included operation in higher speeds and loads than the FTP. Next, like the FTP testing, we then repeated the USO 6 test at full payload. We saw very minimal increases in the speed and load operation of the engine. So next, we switched from testing in the laboratory to testing the truck on road in the Southern California area for comparison to test cycles in the lab. We operated the truck at the same half payload and used a route from our El Monte laboratory to Oxnard. A town about 80 miles to the west includes freeway and some city driving. As you can see, the vehicle's engine operation starts to cover a much broader range of speeds and loads than the chassis test cycles can include. So on the next test, we see the difference between laboratory and on-road is magnified when we drive the same route while towing a trailer loaded up to nearly 80% of the rated tow capacity. Here, we see an even broader spectrum of the whole engine speed and load regions being used, somewhat similar to the points included in the heavy-duty engine test cycle. On the previous slide, This testing confirmed what we suspected, that the existing chassis test cycles cover a limited portion of what is happening on road. As we move to the next slide. So in the previous slide, we showed you the differences in engine operation for each test. Now let's take a look at the differences in emissions. Although several vehicles were tested, this slide shows example results from one of the test diesel vehicles across the spectrum of testing we did. The graph on the left shows the emission test results for our chassis lab testing. We found that in the lab for the FTP test cycle, emissions at half payload and full payload are very similar. This is expected because the vehicle engine operation between the two tests are very similar, as we showed on the previous slide. The graph on the right shows our on-road emissions test results. The emissions vary based on the driving and are generally higher than what we saw in the lab, with emissions around 0.3 grams per mile when operated at half payload and above 0.8 grams per mile when towing. As we saw in the previous slide, on-road driving does include a broader spectrum of engine operation that is not covered by the chassis test cycle, and the higher emission test results confirm that the current chassis cycles are not ensuring in-use emission controls is as good as it is on the test cycles themselves. From our testing, we can conclude that the laboratory testing at full payload does not lead to increased emissions because engine operation does not change much from a half payload. At this point, we will not be proposing changes to the test procedures to add full payload testing. On-road testing is showing that emissions are higher on-road and they increase even more when towing. And our chassis cycles do not cover the full range of engine operation that occurs on-road. Our updated proposal is to align with the recent changes already made for engine certified MDVs in the heavy-duty regulations and propose identical in-use testing procedures and standards for chassis certified MDVs. This would mean that all MDVs, regardless of how they are certified, would be required to meet the same in-use standards. This will better ensure equivalence across the MDV class and also help ensure robust emission controls for the full range of engine operation that occurs on road. For those of you not familiar with the newly adopted heavy-duty procedures that already covered the engine-certified MDVs, this will give you a little background on how it works and how it will be applied to chassis-certified MDVs. Testing is done on-road for both gasoline and diesel MDVs and second-by-second emissions, and diesel MDVs. And second-by-second emissions and engine operating data is collected with the PEMS. The data is then analyzed by looking at cumulative emissions over a 5-minute window. As shown in the graph on the left, the windows start at each second and will be overlapping, such that even a short 10-minute trip can have over 300 overlapping distinct 5-minute windows. Each window is then binned based on the average engine load in that window, as shown in the table, and a maximum emission standard is defined for each of the bins. Today, we are also providing a handout through the webinar with the exact method and calculations, and would like to get your feedback. So now we will take a look at how the emissions from the chassis certified MDVs we have tested compare to these in-use standards. The graph on the left is of the low load operation bin. For the diesel vehicles that we tested, the emissions shown are for NOx in grams per brake horsepower hour, just like the heavy-duty engine standards. And using the identical heavy-duty calculation method described in the last slide, for our on-road testing, we tested over several different routes and one route with towing. Each bar represents an individual test on that route. Towing is shown in the dark green bars. This is the heavy-duty 2024 standard compared to our emission results for the low load bin. As you can see, many chassis certified MDVs can already meet the 2024 standard with the better performers capable of meeting it even while towing. And here is where the heavy-duty 2030 standard would be, which, as expected, is much more stringent and would require further reductions in emissions. However, even this stringency would require between a 30 to 60% reduction from the current levels, rather than a 90% reduction that the heavy-duty rulemaking estimated would be necessary for most engines. And of note, the 2019 model year Cummins that was subject to an emissions recalibration is already fairly close to meeting the 2030 standard with no change to its certified hardware. On the right-hand side, we show the data for the medium-high load operation bin. As expected, we see the emissions are higher in this bin, especially during towing, as this is also the area of engine operation that is not covered during our chassis dyno testing, and is the primary reason we are pursuing additional standards. Getting to the levels of the heavy-duty 2024 and 2030 standards will take more work, and likely entail software and hardware changes as projected in the heavy-duty rulemaking. That said, the previously mentioned 2019 Cummins is already very close except while towing, and that is with its current hardware configuration. While it is not shown here, we have also evaluated the idle bin for diesels and found that chassis certified MDVs can readily meet even the heavy-duty 2030 standard. We have also started testing gasoline MDVs and will be evaluating the auto bin heavy-duty standards. And of course, we will need to continue our evaluation of diesels to ensure consistency with the heavy-duty standards for engine certified MDVs, and to develop an implementation timing for these new standards on chassis certified MDVs. So next, we will be changing topics a little to introduce a new MDV proposal, which will be a standalone standard for MDVs. Currently, MDVs certified to a composite supplemental FTP standard similar to light-duty vehicles that takes into account emissions across 3 different cycles. However, just like light-duty vehicles, the composite standard does not ensure good emission controls during USO 6 driving conditions. We have now collected test data on several MDVs in Class 2B and Class 3 on the USO 6 and unified test cycle, and believe the data supports more stringent standards. Accordingly, we are proposing to adopt a new standalone standard for MDVs on the USO 6 test cycle that will better ensure robust control than the current composite standard does. In this slide, we provide test data to support our proposal. Testing was done for several different MDVs, certified to the Lev 3 standards on the chassis dyno. As a reminder, Class 2Bs certified using the USO 6 test cycle, which is tested on the top graph, and the Class 3 vehicles certified using the unified cycle, which is tested on the bottom graph. Each bar represents the average emission results for that vehicle based on several replicate tests, and represents emissions at full useful life, either through the application of a deterioration factor or testing with an age after treatment system. So to show the existing composite standard, the USO 6 and unified emission results for the majority of the vehicles are already well below the composite standard, but we do have one example vehicle that, while compliant with the composite standard, has emissions on the USO 6 cycle that are 4 to 5 times larger than the others. I'd also like to point out the previously mentioned 2019 Cummins Ram, which is emitting at emissions levels far below the composite standard and is much cleaner than most other vehicles for both the Class 2B and Class 3 model. The vehicle has shown it can be clean on the road and on the dyno with its current hardware, even before considering equivalent after treatment changes, which would be expected as needed to meet the future heavy-duty low NOx standards. At this point, We are still investigating the level of stringency for our proposed standalone standard. We have not determined the exact emission level yet or the potential implementation timing, and we will be following up with more testing and discussions with manufacturers to refine the proposal. But our intent is to clearly align the stringency not just with what the better performers today are capable of, but also with the expected improvements that would come with meeting the same in-use PAMS-based standards as adopted for the engine certified MDVs in the heavy-duty omnibus package. So as this is a workshop, we would like to hear feedback on the proposed in-use method and standards that we presented today. And as noted, we are continuing to test vehicles and look at test data, and will be developing regulation language for our MDV proposals. Further, given the different typical usage of MDVs than light-duty vehicles, such as in small business fleets, last mile delivery, and vocational usage, and the higher fraction of diesel engines, we plan to separately look at the impacts of our MDV proposals on disadvantaged communities when analyzing the cost and benefits. Thank you. This concludes the part of our workshop on our proposals for heavier vehicles. We will now move to questions.
Thanks, Kevin. And actually, so people can be using the chat to submit their questions. And while you guys are doing that, I'm going to take advantage of our virtual workshop here to launch a poll and get everybody primed for all the ZEV topics coming up. So I'm just going to display this poll, and I'll give people a little bit of time to think about this, and also to submit your questions if you have any. And then we'll show the poll results right before we move on to the next section. Okay, looks like the entries are slowing down. So 10 more seconds, and then I'm going to close it. There we go. Okay, Shobna, I think, is going to be moderating our questions. So do you want to share your screen?
I'm trying to switch to my screen here. Give me 1 second. Okay. Okay. So let's start with our first question. I'm going to put in slide presentation mode here so that everybody can. Okay. So I'm going to read out the question and hopefully and call on people to answer. So let's start with our first question here. Slide 4. If you look at emissions in 2017, there's no benefit from ACC1. ACC1 started in 2015. Consequently, there's no benefit from ACC1 shown in that graph is what I'm assuming. If you looked at 2030 or 2035, the contribution from light duty vehicles and medium duty passenger vehicles would probably be smaller. So Mike, if you want to answer that question.
Sure.
Yes, so we are, good morning, it's Mike McCarthy, sorry, I didn't introduce myself. Yes, Steve, we're trying to get updated inventory pie charts, if you will, from our inventory divisions to get something more reflective of what's the future. Obviously, as you know, things have been pretty dynamic the last few years in trying to apportion the shares going forward. So directionally, light duty will go down to a smaller amount. But keep in mind that the heavy duty was a big chunk, especially in the NOx, and it's going to go down quite a bit because of the heavy duty omnibus. So the light duty is still going to end up being a significant percentage of the remaining emissions. But yes, we are getting that. We are not trying to purposely use old, outdated slides to make light duty look like it's a bigger impact than it is. But we've made, MFAC 2021 was recently released. It's changed a lot of things, so they're trying to reapportion the sources now and get us an updated pie chart, and we will commit to having that updated for any future workshops and presentations.
Okay, the next question there is slide 5, hydrogen ICEs is not indicated in the roadmap. Is there a plan to change the definition of TZEVs for ECC2? Mike, do you want to take that one as well?
Sure. We have not been looking into hydrogen fueled internal combustion engines. We had done some work in that many years ago, and there didn't seem to be any further interest in it. And there seemed to be at the time some NOx criteria pollutant concerns. So if somebody has some new research they'd like to share with us or point to us, but it has not been something that's been on our radar and looking at it. On the second part of the question, I'll ask you to hold that thought because Anna will be presenting in the next hour, I think, here on exactly that about what is TZEV today, which is mostly the plug-in hybrids, and what we're thinking about for future plug-in hybrids. But if your question is specifically about whether we're considering hydrogen ICE in there, we do not have that on the table at this time.
Okay, go to the next slide. Let's see. All right, does this presentation suggest that drivers should be advised to idle for 20 seconds or more before drive away? I guess that almost no one understands this in the driver population. And I don't think that's the point of when we were talking about the different idle times. What we're trying to show is different emissions that happen if you're idling for 5 seconds versus 10 versus 20, and how our test procedures in the FTP, there is an idle for 20 seconds. So I don't know if Marco or Mike, do you want to add more to that?
Yeah, I can jump in. Currently, pretty much all vehicles are calibrated to count on a 20-second idle to heat up the catalyst before the drive off. So certainly idling for 20 seconds at the start of a trip will help reduce emissions, especially starting the car in the morning after it was turned off overnight. And having a quicker drive away will generally increase emissions. And that's basically one of the key reasons why we're working on this proposal to help control these emissions.
Okay, and the next question there, for US06 currently, we use different deterioration factors. For your new proposal, use same DF as FTP. Marco or Mike, do you want to take that?
Sure, that's Mike, I can take that. Thank you for bringing it up because it had not been something we remembered about, but we will definitely have to revisit that during our proposal and look there. Currently, we believe it is an option for the manufacturer to use the same or different DFs across the cycles if their data supports it. So we'll have to look at that language and understand what it means, going forward with our proposal. I would hope that it would be a setup where it's dependent on your data. If your data supports using the same DF, we can do that. But we will commit to looking at that. That's obviously a great detail for us to make sure we look at closer.
Okay, I'm going to move to the next slide here that Jason is going to take. So Jason, do you want to read the question and answer? I put the answers in there already, but go ahead, Jason.
Yeah, yep, I got it, sure. Okay, so question is, does the proposed PUF emissions proposal affect OEMs, aftermarket, or both? I'm asking because I work for a company that manufactures both, that manufactures aftermarket extended range fuel tanks. All right, so yeah, the answer there is it does affect both. Reason is because the regulations that we have that do apply to motor vehicles, they apply, yeah, they apply both to those, the original manufacturers of those vehicles, and then they also apply to folks who are going to make aftermarket changes to those vehicles. So yeah, that's the answer to that one. And then also, I just wanted to reiterate that the PUF proposal is going to only apply to vehicles that have the the non-integrated refueling canister on the system. So that's the system that's normally sealed that you'd usually find on plug-in hybrid vehicles, and some hybrid vehicles are using that as well. And then I guess in this case would probably apply as well, because I'm pretty sure that vehicles that use extended range on a plug-in hybrid vehicle would be usually use that kind of fuel tank. So I think that concludes that part of the answer for that particular question. Moving to the next question, slide number 24. Does this mean that, okay, so this also applies to the PUF emissions proposal as well. And the question is, does this mean that 80 to 90% of the vehicles already have canisters that meet the PUF proposal? So the answer to that one is yes. Yeah, that was the point I was trying to convey there, is that based upon our preliminary analysis of current vehicles that use that specialized type of fuel system, the normally sealed fuel system, it looks like about 80 to 90% of the vehicles already have a canister that would meet, canister that is big enough to meet that proposal. So that's it for those two questions.
Okay. All right, let's go to our next question here. Are the results from slide 26 to 27 reflected in CARB's current emission factors for trucks? Does this suggest that the emission factors are inaccurate, that real world emissions are higher than the factors, and that emission factors should be revised upwards? So for, and these are for medium duty vehicles, right? Marco or Belinda, can you bring up those slides? Or actually, let's see here.
Yeah, sure, Mike. I think this Mike, I talked to this a little bit, right? Yeah, so
okay.
This was about medium duty, where we saw that when we take the trucks on road, we're seeing higher emissions than we see on the chassis dyno test cycles. So we do have to loop back with our inventory people that in the modeling. They have used some on-road data, mostly on-road data, to populate some of the heavy duty factors. They've used mostly chassis dyno to populate some of the light duty stuff. And so I'm just not positive yet for your answer on in the medium duty sector, whether they have relied more heavily on some chassis dyno work or some on-road PEM sort of based work. So we'll have to follow up with them and look at that and see what they've got modeled. Unfortunately, that's sort of the normal process when we consider new rulemakings, right? We look for areas where there could be excess emissions that we could clean up. Sometimes they're reflected in the model already, sometimes they're not, because we discover new things and then we have to reflect them in the model. So, but this one, I said, I know they've updated the heavy duty quite a bit. So I think it's worth going back and looking where they're at right now and whether we think it's reflective of what we're seeing. The other part, which leads to another question somebody already asked, I think, which is we don't have good data on what fraction of the time these vehicles are being operated at half payload, full payload, a little bit of towing, or heavy amount of towing. I mean, I think the answer is probably all of the above, right? We just, the medium-duty category is very diverse, from individual private citizen owners that occasionally do things with them to effectively business fleet work trucks that do work all the time. So if somebody does have some data that help us there, that would be very useful in updating our inventory assumptions and stuff there. But we'll have to get back on how well our model currently reflects this variety of operation and the emissions that we're seeing, the emission levels that we're seeing on the trucks today.
Shobna, I think we can only take a couple more questions, so because we have to move on.
Okay, I'm going to just read the questions and not put them on slides. I think that may be just easier. So let's see, we had a question on similar to NMOG plus NOx, will the PM limits be set to the same level as FTP? Any consideration to reduce the PM limit for the FTP cycle below 1 milligram per mile? And I can take that one on the second part there. Any consideration of reducing the PM limit for FTP? Right now, we are not considering that. We will be bringing the PM proposals to you in our next workshop in July. And I guess for, so right now, we are just looking at, as we presented in our last workshop, changing the USO6 standard for PM. I'll take one, I'll look at one more question here. Have you looked into PM, it's another PM question. Have you looked at PM emissions from light duty vehicles during aggressive cycles or on-road driving conditions? GDI vehicles emit high PM during transient operation, and that is not captured from the FTP test. So yes, we are looking at the USO6 cycle and looking at proposing a lower standard for the USO6 PM. There was one more medium duty vehicle questions. Let me get to that. Many drivers keep their truck idling while they are loading or unloading for hours. Is there a regulation to stop them from doing that? And I know in the heavy duty space, there is a separate standard they have for clean idle. We are not looking at that for medium duty vehicles. And I know one of the slides, we had some background on medium duty vehicles, and just, you know, there are a lot more gasoline in that category. And usually for gasoline, there's no, you know, there isn't a huge problem on idle. In the bins for diesel medium duty vehicles, there is an idle bin, so they will be meeting those standards. I don't know, Mike, if you wanted to add anything more to that.
No, I said we will. There's several questions on PM. We're going to cover those mostly in our next workshop. So I apologize, but hold your questions on that one, because we've been focused on the NMOG plus NOx at this point. That it's also some questions around the inventory and the modeling and the health effects. We are working with our modeling folks quite a bit right now to try to see, as I described, sometimes you discover areas that are not reflected in the model. So we have representative data of that, so we can model the health benefits and emission benefits of some of these things. So stay tuned. We are working closely with the MFAC team now that they've got their 2021 version out there. And then the last thing is a fair amount of questions at when would these new proposals start? So we are looking at, obviously we're not going to, these are not all the proposals we do are not going to simultaneously go into effect in a single model year. As we've worked with manufacturers in the past, we tend to support phase-ins of these kind of things. And I think it's almost like a line by line item to figure out what things take what kind of lead time, and you know, stuff with calibration changes. We generally put in shorter amount of lead time and quicker phase-ins, and stuff that would potentially require hardware changes, we do something different. So I think that is a fair question, and we are trying to refine the proposals and then refine starting implementation timelines that we imagine will go back and forth with some dialogue as manufacturers think about their individual product plans.
Yeah, and the only thing I wanted to add to that is, October timeframe is when we're looking at to get our proposal out, and that's probably when we'll be presenting all of our emissions impact and economic impacts for our proposal at the fall workshop. That's our timeline for now. Okay, Belinda, we'll get back to you.
Okay, so I'm just going to share our quick poll results. So it looks like we have a slightly disproportionately representative set of drivers here relative to the California market, but a lot of interested people in ZEVs in the future. So I'll turn it over to Anna. Just one other quick note, when you're writing questions, if you're comfortable having your name and affiliation announced with your question, please just include that in your question because we can't actually see your organization, and we're just also not sure if you want your name shared. So Anna.
Okay, are people seeing my screen? I just want to make sure.
Yes.
Yeah? Okay. Okay, everyone, thanks so much for joining us today. There's a really big group of you, and it's so exciting to be able to use this technology so that we can have even more people join. But my name is Anna Wong, and I'm here to present staff's proposal for the zero emission vehicle regulation for model years 2026 through 2035. Okay, the ZEV regulation was first adopted in 1990 as a footnote to a table within the first low emission vehicle regulation, which we just heard the amendments to. And over the years, it's morphed into a credit-based regulation that is in place in California and in 10 states that have adopted our regulation, and we call those the Section 177 states. On the graph above is the adopted credit requirements for new vehicle manufacturers within California for 2012 through 2025 model year. The darker shaded area represents the maximum number of credits from plug-in hybrids a manufacturer can produce in compliance with the program, and the lighter gray area represents the minimum number of credits from ZEVs, meaning a battery electric vehicle or a hydrogen fuel cell electric vehicle. And when we lay over how manufacturers have complied, you can see there's been consistent overcompliance with the regulations currently adopted through 2019 model year. And by the end of this year, we'll see 2020 compliance, which is just coming in now. In total, this represents 380,000 ZEVs and 245,000 plug-in hybrids cumulatively that have received credit in the regulation through 2019 model year. Moving from a historical view to near-term projections, manufacturers annually submit alternative fuel vehicle projections to ARB, including projections for battery electric, plug-in hybrids, and hydrogen fuel cell vehicles, primarily to help staff with infrastructure planning. Moving from 8% of actual new vehicle sales in 2020, you can see steady projected growth through 2023 model year to over 25% of sales, according to the OEM's own projections. Over the next few months, staff will be updating these projections based on the OEM's 2021 responses to the survey, which are currently being collected. What we're finding as we turn to the consumers who may be purchasing these vehicles is that the base of electric vehicle enthusiasts is solid and even growing. In a recent J.D. Power survey, electric vehicle owners responded that most intend to even purchase another electric vehicle. And according to new studies done by researchers at UC Davis, many car buyers continue to at least consider electric vehicles as real options within their households, even as skeptics remain. And looking further into that data, 25% of those surveyed are actively gathering information or even shopping for an electric vehicle as their next purchase. This is similar to other studies that show 30 to 45% of people within the United States would consider an electric vehicle when buying their next car. It must be noted, however, that more needs to be done, as education and actual vehicle experience often increases awareness of new technologies. Also, the market is likely lagging for low-income households who are less likely to purchase new or used ZEVs due to barriers outlined in CARB's SB 350 low-income barrier study, including high vehicle prices, lack of information, and lack of convenient charging. However, we can see automakers are growing in their enthusiasm. Automakers representing 1/3 of California's market have already announced targets for greater than 50% ZEV sales by 2030, as well as significant financial commitments to electrification and sustainability. This is being driven not only by California's push towards electrification, but jurisdictions around the world. Momentum has been building around electrification worldwide. Countries around the world have already been taking action on 100% vehicle electrification commitments or an outright ban of gasoline sales as early as 2025, as shown in the map above. In addition to these commitments, several large markets where passenger vehicles are sold have adopted policies and regulations that will additionally call for higher and higher volumes of electric vehicles. Additionally, support from the federal government has been growing in recent months as the federal administration has announced revisiting rolled-back vehicle greenhouse gas rules and rejoining international climate agreements. Just last week, the United States committed to cutting greenhouse gas emissions 50% by 2030, a commitment that would likely require some substantial level of vehicle electrification. Also, the proposed infrastructure bill could also provide a significant boost for electric vehicle incentives and infrastructure. So I'm going to start today off on the topic of stringency by talking about real vehicles. Often when we talk about the ZEV regulation, it can be confusing as it's historically been a credit-based requirement with vehicles earning varying amount of credit, leading to uncertainty as to how many vehicles we're really talking about. So let's flip the script and start directly with the percentage of new car sales that would be required to be ZEVs in our proposal. Our goal first and foremost was to develop a stringency that would achieve 100% by 2035. You can see that this trajectory requires a slightly more aggressive ramp-up rate in the first 6 years of the regulation and a moderately less aggressive rate in the final years to 2035, as it is expected to take more time for conventional vehicle manufacturers to electrify some of the last vehicle segments and develop products that appeal to the hardest to satisfy new vehicle purchasers. Lastly, we want to propose a ZEV regulation that transitions away from credits and increases certainty in actual vehicle numbers to ensure success for the light-duty sector. So how feasible is this stringency? To understand the upper bound for ZEV deployments, we created some scenarios based on individual vehicle model redesign schedules, which are typically every 5 to 6 years. For pre-2026 model year, we assumed that announced new ZEVs would replace an analogous existing model in the fleet at its 2019 market share at the time of its release. Then, beginning with 2026 model year, individual vehicle models would be converted to a ZEV at their expected redesign year. In the ASAP, or as soon as possible scenario, 100% of sales of that model would be converted to a ZEV in the earliest redesign year after 2026. In the slow phase scenario, gasoline and ZEV variants of the model continue to be sold after the redesign, but the market share of the ZEV variant increases each year based on the relative sales share of that model within the OEM's portfolio, with the best sellers allowed 10 years to fully convert over to the ZEV variant. Finally, in the delayed fuel cell deployment scenario, delays the conversion of top-selling models from fuel cell-oriented manufacturers until their earliest redesign year after 2030 to allow more time for costs to continue to fall for fuel cell technology. To be clear, these are not market projections based on consumer demand models or from a market forecasting agency. There's simply a double check that there's a plausible pathway for manufacturers to introduce enough new ZEVs at the at a pace necessary to meet the stringency targets while remaining on a somewhat conventional redesign schedule. So I want to shift the focus on how we have reimagined turning this kind of stringency back into a ZEV regulation, consistent with our ultimate goal to shift away from credits and toward certainty in vehicle sales. So today's staff will present a proposal on the treatment of ZEVs and plug-in hybrids going forward, as well as a way to handle historical credits earned before 2026 model year. So overall, staff does believe there's still a use for some sort of credit-based regulation, at least in the near term. Allowing for appropriate banking, trading, and fulfillment of deficits can still appropriately afford manufacturers the flexibility needed to fully transition to electrification and handle year-to-year fluctuations and redesigns. However, each of the proposals you will hear about move industry from a highly flexible ZEV regulation to a regulation that is meant to provide more assurance around increasing ZEV volumes to achieve the ultimate goal of 100% sales. To that end, staff is proposing a one-for-one credit structure for battery electric vehicles and fuel cells. Historically, different aspects of ZEVs have been credited for good reason, range being the main driver for many iterations of the regulation. However, competition in the market is now driving range higher and higher as battery costs come down and the consumer base grows. In addition to this shift in crediting, staff is proposing to impose a 5-year credit life for 2026 and subsequent model year credits, which aligns with other light-duty regulations. This will ensure volumes grow towards 100% target and that credits are used to manage year-to-year fluctuations as originally intended, rather than to accumulate large banks to save off further deployment of ZEV. Shifting from ZEVs to plug-in hybrids, I want to remind everyone of the work done leading up to the Advanced Clean Cars midterm review back in 2017. And looking through millions of data points on thousands of ZEVs and plug-in hybrids, staff concluded that electric vehicle miles traveled is highly driver dependent and increases with vehicle electric power capability and electric range. Also found in that study was the existence of high power start emissions from plug-in hybrids, an issue discussed earlier this morning with Marco's criteria pollutant portion of the workshop. Staff believes that plug-in hybrids will still play a role in developing the ZEV market, especially when the goal is 100% ZEVs and all segments need to be electrified. Studies show that model diversity and availability are key to driving consumer interest. Plug-in hybrids also may remain a critical choice for low-income drivers. According to data from the Clean Cars for All program, participants swapped out older vehicles for a plug-in hybrid at 4 times the rate that they did for a battery electric vehicle. Staff believes that keeping plug-in hybrids as a compliance option within the regulation will better ensure success. However, our greenhouse gas reduction targets and ambient air quality standards require us to balance the risks and emissions from gasoline usage and plug-in hybrids that will need to keep plug-in hybrids as an option to truly achieving that 100% of new car sales. To that end, staff is proposing to raise the minimum requirements for plug-in hybrids earning credit within the ZEV regulation for 2026 and subsequent model years. The new minimum label all electric range would need to be at least 50 miles for all size vehicles. Additionally, as evidenced through extensive testing to develop appropriate standards to manage high power start emissions for plug-in hybrids, range is not the only determining factor in how ZEV-like a plug-in hybrid behaves. So staff is proposing plug-in hybrids qualifying for ZEV credit must be able to follow the USO6 cycle on electric power only during the entire charge depleting mode. While this is slightly higher performance than some of the best performing plug-in hybrids available today, this should ensure engine starts are greatly minimized while the battery still has a charge, providing an all-electric driving experience for most trips and has sufficient range to meet most daily driving demands with one or slightly fewer charges per day. These new minimum requirements will be in place in addition to those currently in place for plug-in hybrids earning ZEV credit, meaning QLEV 30 criteria pollutant certification, 0 evaporative emissions, 15 years or 150,000 mile warranty on emission-related parts, and a 10-year 150,000 mile warranty on the vehicle's traction battery. Even with these new minimum qualifications, plug-in hybrids would be expected to still have a significant portion of the overall VMT from operation on gasoline, which will impede progress toward our need to meet greenhouse gas and criteria pollutant reductions. As a result, consistent with the current ZEV regulations, plug-in hybrids will not be able to allowed to fulfill a manufacturer's entire ZEV requirement. And of course, plug-in hybrids would be optional, not required, as we expect some manufacturers to continue to fully pursue ZEV technology and forego building plug-in hybrids altogether. In an effort to balance the emission reductions necessary from light duty with the benefits that plug-in hybrids could offer to grow a ZEV market, staff is proposing to cap where plug-in hybrids can be used to meet up to 20% of the required ZEVs in any given year. Additionally, staff is proposing the same 5-year credit life on new plug-in hybrid credits as is being proposed for ZEV credits, and a continuation of past policies where plug-in hybrids earn credits separately tracked from ZEV credits and can only be used toward the allowable plug-in hybrid portion of the total requirement. Staff believes this proposal, along with the raised minimum qualifications, helps to balance the need to ensure maximum emission reductions while offering the most options for manufacturers and consumers. With today's proposal in place, many OEMs will continue to earn and bank credits through 2025 model year as requirements remain low, and manufacturers will certainly ramp up volumes toward meeting requirements within this next iteration of the ZEV regulation. Looking at the banks today, the industry as a whole has enough credits to satisfy the regulation through 2025 model year. But staff believes that we can't let the success of the prior program be the downfall of the next. Limits must be considered on historical credits if there is any chance of transitioning out of a flexible credit-driven ZEV regulation to one that focuses primarily on vehicle volumes. Therefore, staff is proposing to expire all pre-2026 model year credits by the end of 2030 model year. To ensure manufacturers stay on track to being able to meet CARB's 100% target, staff is also proposing a 15% cap on the use of historical credits within either the ZEV or plug-in hybrid portion of the requirement. I'll preview an example of what this looks like, all rolled up in a few slides. Before I get there, one more way staff is proposing to deal with the large quantities of credits earned prior to 2026 is to convert them to better fit within the new credit structure we are proposing, as we've done in past iterations of the ZEV regulation. Staff is proposing to divide the pre-2026 credit banks by the maximum number of credits earned by vehicles within the category. As an example, we've roughly calculated future credit banks based on those manufacturer projections shown on a previous slide, factoring compliance with the regulation through 2025. As an example, you can see an industry-wide bank of 5.5 million ZEV credits is converted to a bank of just under 1.4 million ZEV credits for use in the 2026 and subsequent model year program. Similarly, 146,000 plug-in hybrid credits is translated to nearly 140,000 plug-in hybrid credits for later use. So you're probably thinking, how does this translate back to the stringency numbers shown to you at the beginning of this presentation, where we started with the required number of actual ZEV vehicles, which are shown again here. Now I've added an example of how this could translate into a credit-based requirement when including plug-in hybrids and historical credits. As we've noted, we intend to transition closer and closer to a requirement that exactly matches the required number of vehicles. And you can see that this proposal would effectively make that transition fully by the 2031 model year, where the requirement and actual sales line meet up from that point on. Keep in mind that even after 2031, manufacturers would still be able to use 2026 model year and newer credits to bank or trade or satisfy deficits and smoothing out year-to-year variations. But those credits would also have a 5-year credit life. So the supply of credits would greatly diminish in successive years as older credits expire and as the requirement increases, leaving a small opportunity to over-comply. So in addition to everything that we've just presented, I just want to point out we really are seeking input on many of these proposals, especially to be explored over the coming months. Overall, we want to hear your thoughts on what are the effects of moving to a lower credit program. Should there be also minimums to qualify for ZEV credit, just like we do now for plug-in hybrid credit? We also just want to explore the world of how the ZEV regulation impacts those most vulnerable within California's population and how we can mitigate those impacts through the regulation. Lastly, there are still many questions around plug-in hybrids. As you see, we've explored them throughout the midterm review, and I point you back to those studies that are posted on our website. But also, there's just a question of how these vehicles should be treated within the regulation. We proposed some things here, but we're seeking input on generally how should those be credited and how should they be treated over time. And are there even other options to encourage better behavior when it comes to plug-in hybrids? And then overall, I do think that we understand that there's historical credits that have played a role within the regulation over time, and we want to hear your opinions on the treatment of those credits going forward. And with that, I'm going to switch over to the questions that you have about this proposal.
Thanks, Anna. And so just to remind everyone, yeah, if you can include slide numbers when you're asking your questions. If you didn't hear earlier the announcement about the handouts, the slides are available for download in the handout section, and so that will help you find the slide number as needed. And also, if you're wanting to have your name and affiliation stated with your question, please include that with your question. And I'm assuming there's going to be a lot of questions in this section. We're not going to be able to get to all of them, so please email them to us at cleancars@arb.ca.gov if we don't get to yours, and we'll answer it offline. But I do need to launch another poll, Shobna. Did you need to?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So I think we saw in the last poll about half of the respondents do not have an EV. So this is really just for you guys here. So if you do not currently drive an EV, we'd like to know what would help you consider one for your next car. So I'll leave this open for like a minute.
Show them, maybe we can start in the questions while people are filling out the poll.
Okay. And again, this is Shobna Sani. I manage the low emission vehicle regulation section. I think it works better if we say the questions and try to answer them instead of trying to post them. It's a little bit more complicated that way. So we'll start with, let me see here. My question keeps moving, so hold on one sec. Okay. So on slide 41, some countries like Canada only have aspirational goals. A bunch of us are working on getting Ottawa to set actual hard targets. Example, mandates, that's lacking for the Canadian program right now, and that's from John Shears. And I guess our answer, yes, we are aware that there is significant variance in what the commitment really means across regions. I think it's still meaningful to see the substantial number of regions moving forward as at a common endpoint. So we are excited to see that. Next question. Do you have data from real world about percentage of plug-in hybrids being charged versus versus the operation as a strong hybrid with a significant weight penalty. And I guess one of the things I wanted to point out, we did look at that data during the midterm review, and it is summarized in our Appendix G of the MTR report. We continue to collect data and are working on minimum requirements, as Anna mentioned in the slide deck here, and to ensure that they are used more in the EV mode. Mike, did you want to add anything else to that?
No, the Appendix G is you can search for that on our website, or look for the search for midterm review or midterm, and you can find it pretty easily. But it's that was a bigger sample of data. We have access to data now, but it's a smaller sample that's building up over time. So we will obviously continue to track this, and as you saw in the feedback that Anna put up there, we are looking for ways. You know, PHEVs have a balance, right, between cost and risk for emissions and their usage patterns, and that. So we are looking for other ideas on what we can do there. We plan to continue to probably to have data in the vehicle so we can track this and see how it goes. I don't think this is a one and done kind of there's old PHEVs, so we may have to, you know, continue to track this and do what we can to incentivize high charging frequency, whether we do that with some of the design requirements or some of the minimum requirements or anything else we can do. But it is certainly one of the things that we struggle to balance. We want PHEVs to be an option. We think it helps meet consumer demands, especially in some of the more in the customers that have different usage patterns or expectations. And we're just trying to balance that with the risk. And there's not a perfect black and white answer as to where the right place to be is.
Okay. And yes, as Mike mentioned, you know, we definitely do want input on that. The next question, there are some applications and customers, especially in rural areas, where EVs will not make sense for a long time, if ever. Is allowing some ICE sales after 2035 for these applications being considered? And I'll let Mike answer, but mostly, you know, we do have another part of the presentation where we talk about our costs and what kind of vehicles we're considering for meeting the 100% target. And we are really looking at BEVs as replacement vehicles, so they will have a long range. But that's part of the evaluation for this reg. Mike, do you want to add more to that?
Yeah, I just gonna say that, I mean, that's why we think we need all three flavors of BEVs and fuel cell electric vehicles and plug-in hybrids in the mix to meet the great variety in consumer needs, demands, and expectations. So yes, I think there are some that a BEV will be tougher to fit into their lifestyle and the way they use vehicles today that a plug-in hybrid might be able to solve, or a fuel cell vehicle. You know, fuel cell in theory is very similar to a gasoline vehicle today, in that you refuel it every week or two. You go to a defined refueling station, you fill it up in 5 minutes, you have your entire range back. So we think that fuel cells and plug-in hybrids are critical in helping meet the goals and needs of all 100% of people and all new sales, and as those cars trickle into used cars. So I think that is the main reason we have all of those in there. So right now we have not reached a point in our analysis where we say that's going to be insufficient, and we need to allow some conventional gasoline cars as well to continue. But we are continuing to look at that, do our analysis, and see where we think BEVs and plug-in hybrids and fuel cell can get us.
Okay, the next question is, will the new plug-in hybrid USO6 requirements be identical to the current ZEV credit benefit, which is greater than 10 miles in USO6 all-electric range? And there was also a question about just ZEV credit calculations for plug-in hybrids. And you know, Anna did present some minimum requirements here, so definitely the range is more than 10 miles, not for USO6, for UDDS cycle. And there's more to come, and some questions we have on the plug-in hybrid minimum requirements. And I'll let Mike answer more on how will the plug-in hybrids be credited going.
Yeah, just to clarify on the credit calculation on the US06. So what Anna presented, right, was that to qualify as a PHEV, you would need to have a 50-mile label range, right? So that's the combination of the multiple cycles to get to that 50-mile range. For the US06 capability, what she had in her slide was that it would need to be all electric on the US06 throughout its charge depleting range. So it's not a minimum range on the US06. It is effectively a non-blended PHEV on the US06. So you would be able to run the US06 electric, you reach your charge sustaining point. On the credit calculation, so on PHEVs, so as Anna talked about, we're focusing on getting to sort of a certainty in vehicle numbers. And so everything we try to talk about today was in sort of percentage of actual sales. And so that's why the cap we talked about, like a cap of 20%, I mean 20% of your ZEVs could be plug-in hybrids, right? So we're trying to talk about real sort of vehicle sales to not confuse the issue anymore when talking in credit space or anything like that. And as you saw her proposal, right, we're trying to transition to something that is more directly linked to vehicle sales. So in theory, you could come up with a credit requirement that's anything you want, right? You could do whatever you want, but again, the focus is on, we think plug-in hybrids probably need to be limited to about 1/5 of the ZEVs if we have, and they need to be highly capable, electrically capable, and they need to be used that way to mitigate the GHG and criteria pollutant impacts from them. So we're still running analyses on that, but that's what you should be thinking about for this proposal. And a credit scheme that we use to achieve that becomes less relevant than the overall mix of vehicles and the risk of criteria balancing between the strength of the PHEV, the appeal to a broader sector of customers, and the risk for criteria and GHG emissions.
Okay, we'll move on to the next question. I just want to be certain, are you saying that the Section 177 states, ZEV states, will essentially need to adopt the ICE ban to be identical to California? And I guess I want to make sure we did not present an ICE ban here, even for this proposal. And I know that, you know, when they are adopting our regulation, they're adopting our regulation as is. You know, I know that we have had options in the past. Anna, do you want to add more to that?
No, I think that you addressed that really well. I think that we will be exploring all these proposals and the effect within the Section 177 states, and anything related to them would be coming up in future workshops to consider. But the states are well aware of this proposal and considering it as appropriately in their states.
Okay, and the next question on slide 50, the cap on historical credits is at 15% of your model year 2025 credit bank. And credit bank is available to be used, or 15% of your model year 2X requirements can be satisfied with historical credits. So I'll let Anna answer that question.
Yeah, thanks Ashley for that clarification. I think that's really helpful for everybody. So we mean in future model years that you would only be able to fulfill your whatever model year 2026, 27, 28, 29, 30 requirement. 15% of that could be from those historical, you know, credit bank, right? So anything earned before 2026 model year. I hope that's helpful, but just send us a chat if that's not helpful and you need further clarifications.
Okay. Are there considerations for battery electric vehicle range and also the difference between label range and real life range? And I know that in our later presentation, we are going to be talking about cost and what range we're using here. So Anna, do you want to take that, or Ryan? I want to just make sure.
Yeah. A lot of what you're going to see in this presentation today is within label range. Obviously, California does not, regulate label range, but it's a space that we think is just more transparent to be able to speak about, and it's just what normal people understand about BEVs. Within the regulation, we will continue to use test cycles to determine range, but we're trying to change more of whatever we want in real life to occur. We're trying to speak within label range. So it's, I would say that it's, we're still operating in both spaces, but it is, the regulation will always use test ranges because that's something that we can test kind of equally among all manufacturers. And but when we're presenting about it, we're really trying to speak within the label range. So we'll be converting everything so that it's kind of equivalent across the two.
Okay, the next one is also for you, Anna. Can you clarify the historical credit expiration policy? The slide shows that credits expire by model year. Does this mean that historical credits expire at different times for different automakers?
Yeah, so anything we're proposing to lump all any credit earned before 2026 model year into one bucket and expire all of those credits at the same time in 2030, right? So it kind of allows those credits to play within the first 5 years of the regulation. But that does mean that maybe a 2023 model year credit lasts all the way through 2030. But it's not different for different manufacturers. It's just it's a phase out of all those credits by 2030 when we lump them all together. Again, let us know if you want further explanation beyond that.
Okay, and the next question, have we looked at the role battery swap may play in reaching low-income consumers going forward? That's Levi Telemann from Ample. Marissa, do you want to take that question?
Yeah, definitely. This is Marissa Williams, manager of the light duty vehicle regulation section here at CARB. I think we are interested in having conversations around how battery swap can play that role in reaching low-income consumers, and happy to continue engagement moving forward on this. Right now, we're not trying to limit any of the technology that could help advance zero-emission vehicles in this space. So if you feel as though we are proposing something that does that, please let us know as well, but happy to engage further and learn more about how you all think battery swap will help our low-income and disadvantaged communities.
Okay, Rick Wachowski from EDF. What is ARB planning regarding EV charging accessibility? I know Mark Wenzel is going to answer that for us.
Hi, good morning. Thanks. Yeah, this is Mark Wenzel at the California Energy Commission. The general, and there are lots of exceptions to this, but the general division of responsibilities here in the state is that the Energy Commission works on infrastructure while CARB works on the vehicles. Of course, there's lots of overlap and lots of communication, so we're glad to be here today to help support our colleagues in CARB on their proposal. California is doing a lot on ZEV infrastructure, both for charging and for hydrogen fueling. We have goals in the state of 250,000 chargers by 2025. And then the Energy Commission has also recently published a draft report under AB 2127 that looks at the number of chargers required for 5 million or 8 million vehicles, two different pathways for the higher goals required by the governor's executive order. So that draft report is out now, and then the next version should be out shortly. The governor's budget this year called for an additional $1 billion in investment in ZEV infrastructure. Some of that is light duty charging, light duty hydrogen fueling. A significant portion of that is also in medium duty and heavy duty to accelerate those. And then with the word accessibility, I also wanted to talk to that a little bit. We have a reporting requirement under SB 1000 to look at the distribution of chargers and accessibility of chargers to the public. About half of Clean Transportation Program investments are in disadvantaged communities, and the Clean Transportation Program Investment Plan calls for that number to stay at half or above over the next 3 years. The SB 1000 analysis last year looked at sort of statewide trends, averages across disadvantaged communities and low-income communities. This year, we are going to be doing more looking at a finer geographic detail and thinking about ways that we can use that more detail to help us steer investments. So I would just summarize by saying the state's doing a lot in infrastructure. We're paying careful attention to distribution and access, and there's more to come on making sure that we continue to refine both our understanding and accessibility of the chargers that we fund with our investments. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Mark. So Anna, we've got a couple of questions here that I'm kind of combined together, asking about the Section 177 states, effectively saying, is CARB considering the BEV shares of other Section 177 states when creating their requirements? We use data from the AB8 report to inform our starting place, but what data are we using to inform similar projections for the other ZEV states? Are you considering any flexibilities that can be used for the other S177 states? So kind of a common theme across several questions there.
Yep. Thanks everybody for those questions. I know that this is going to be a big hole within this first presentation. So these all will be considered over the coming months. We thought that it was important to get out with the California proposal first, and then work with Section 177 states on how this would fit in to their timelines, to their own projections. They have ways of doing their own projections within their own states, since California isn't an expert on any one of those markets. So there is more work to be done in this area, but the Section 177 states have been actively engaged on the topic, and some of those states have even adopted similar executive orders to California. So I think that folks are really wanting to be on the same page with where California is heading. But there's more to be explored in this space, and stay tuned for future workshops on more proposals related to them. Soon to come. That's what I would say about that.
Okay, and then I think we're running out of time here, so I'm just going to try to lump together a few more questions that were related to greenhouse gas emissions. People were asking about whether proposed changes to the ZEV, how will the changes to the ZEV reg interact with the GHG standards? Are you considering some sort of carve out relative to the ICE engines? Like you proposed for criteria pollutants, are you considering making the GHG emissions or the CO2 fleet standards sort of removing the ZEVs from that? And are you evaluating the GHG life cycle of electric vehicles and addressing GHG impacts of electricity generation, transmission, and storage loss? So I can talk about it a little bit. So yes, there is a huge interaction, just like we had with light duty on the criteria pollutant, between greenhouse gas and BEVs. So that's why we have not developed our greenhouse gas emission standards yet. We've begun work with EPA on that, and we are probably going to have that as a separate rulemaking than the ACC2 rulemaking, because there's so much dynamically going on with greenhouse gas emission standards, both in revising what's on the books right now and setting the next set of standards. But absolutely, we have to keep in mind the interplay between what we set for a ZEV requirement and whatever we set for a GHG requirement. So I don't have an answer for you today as to exactly what that will look like, but certainly we're looking at options that include or exclude ZEVs from those kind of things, just like we looked at with criteria pollutants. And as to the life cycle emissions, certainly we do look at well-to-wheel type emissions when we do our mobile source strategies and on our long-term sort of scoping plans for how we're going to get to the end goals of air quality, ambient air quality, and greenhouse gas targets. So not all those elements are reflected in the vehicle regs themselves. We have other regulations on sources like electricity generation sources. We already have very aggressive targets on moving to renewable energy that have actually been exceeded every year. So Yes, we do that. We do take that into account. It is part of the long-term planning solution and still points to heavy electrification is needed to get there, but not all of it is reflected in the vehicle regs itself.
Okay, I know we are short on time, so I'm going to try to lump some questions here that we had on incentives and just different. So with 70% of annual car sales being used vehicles, we need more focus on how to support this market to provide options to disadvantaged communities. How is this handled in your ideas to incentivize the market? I know later in our presentation, we will be talking about our ZEV assurance measures, and that's really looking at durability requirements, warranty requirements, in-use requirements for ZEV. So I will kind of hold off on that a little bit. I think that is really to help the used market. So we will have that as part of the later presentation. And then since we are transitioning to electric vehicles, another question, what will be done to help low-income families who cannot afford zero-emission vehicles to be part of the transition to electric vehicles? I can have Marissa, do you want to take that question?
Yeah, we are currently actively exploring ideas, within Advanced Clean Cars to help address some of the inequities and environmental justice concerns. And we are also working closely with our colleagues that work on various incentive and grant programs that help facilitate access for low-income drivers to help get into a zero-emission vehicle. So if you have any input, we're happy to chat with you further and engage further on this topic. And we'll be, I think, detailing that a little bit later in the conversation as well.
Okay, and there's one more follow-up question there. Will there be incentives for technologies that will close the gap between label and real BEV range? Will there be incentives for technologies such that allow fast charging? Both of this to minimize impact on charging stations and grid. And I would just say that, as far as having different incentives in the regulation, we definitely are looking at, and then that's part of the questions that we have is what are things to incentivize? Is it range? Is it charging? Is it, different fast charging over level 2 charging? And what part of that is part of the credit system? So those are the questions that, Anna had on one of the slides. Anna, do you want to add anything else to that?
Nope, I think you covered it.
Okay. Okay, I know there's a lot more questions here, but in the interest of time, I think what we will do is try to answer them through the chat to people who've asked them, and then also, try to come back to some of these questions in some of the later presentations if we have time. So Belinda, back to you.
Thanks, Jomna. I think what we're going to do now is take a quick break, and then when we come back from the break, I'll reveal the exciting poll results. So yeah, the questions ran a little long, so we'll just kind of take a little bit short of a break, but it's such a long workshop. I think people need a little bit of a stretch break, water break, whatever. So we'll see you back here in a couple minutes. Okay, everyone. So hopefully you're all back at your desks or computers or devices. I'm just going to share the results of our poll. So looks like, oh, you're not, there you go, are seeing that price seems to be the main factor, but charging range also large contributor. So hopefully the next few years we'll see a lot of offerings that are going to help satisfy this other segment of the market. And relatedly, I think Ryan is going to talk a lot about these vehicle attributes. So I'm going to pass it over to Ryan. Ryan, we're not hearing you if you're talking. Andrew, are you there?
Hi, Belinda. Yeah, I'm here.
So it's not just my speakers. No one can hear Ryan, right? Okay.
Well, Andrew, you might have to fill in until Ryan gets his audio problem resolved.
Okay. Should I just go ahead and start then?
Right, trying to get a message from Ryan to see if he's resolving it right now, but maybe at least do the introduction of what we're doing, and then we'll see if we can get Ryan to join on video.
Okay. Yeah, and I apologize. I do not have a webcam right now. I'm having webcam difficulties on my own. So my name is Andrew Martinez. I'm a staff air pollution specialist in the, oh, there's Ryan. Hey, Ryan, did you want to go ahead and start the introduction then?
Is it working now?
Yeah.
Okay, I think I can hear, but I can't hear. So I'm going to get started here, and hopefully we can transition over to Andrew okay in some of these slides, and this will work. So hello, sorry for the delay. My apologies on this. Apparently my headset decided to freak out in the middle of this. So my name's Ryan Hart, and I'm an air resources engineer in the light duty vehicle regulations section, and will be presenting on ZEV costing along with my colleague Andrew Martinez.
Yes, and I'm Andrew Martinez. I'm a staff air pollution specialist in the zero emission vehicle infrastructure section, and I'll be helping Ryan with this presentation, especially on the fuel cell costing projections.
So today we'll be sharing updates on incremental zero emission vehicle costs. For our final proposal and rulemaking process, we will certainly be doing a full economic analysis and looking at total costs and benefits to consumers and society. But for today, we are presenting on our work solely regarding incremental costs that will impact the initial purchase price of new vehicles. First, we will describe the process we use for developing incremental zero emission vehicle costs. Then we will share some of the technology updates we have incorporated into our analysis since our last workshop, and the additional sources we are using for this analysis. We will then walk through how we have separated the major groupings of components on the vehicles and some of their specific costs over the years covered by this proposed rule. Next, we will show how California's light-duty vehicle fleet is apportioned in terms of vehicle classifications and the all-electric ranges we have chosen to model for each of the different ZEV technologies. We will then look at the incremental costs rolled up for the respective ZEV technologies for one example vehicle category, and discuss the additional technology packages that are added on top of the base technology cost to account for customer preferences in a 100% ZEV sales scenario. Lastly, we will discuss some areas that we are seeking more data on and our next steps on our cost analysis work. I will now turn it over to Andrew Martinez to briefly discuss our incremental cost methodology.
As we begin the discussion today, we want to clarify the scope of the factors directly considered in developing ZEV technology costs that we will be presenting today. In general, the cost for components and vehicles can be impacted by a wide range of fundamental considerations such as consumer preferences, infrastructure availability, trends in vehicle automation and private ownership, cost of raw materials, and other factors. These foundational principles impact the choices made for vehicle design to meet consumer needs and the costs of the individual components. In the methodology we will outline today, we have focused on describing incremental vehicle costs as a function of vehicle design and component costs. Additional foundational factors are not directly investigated by our cost modeling methodology, but we rely on data and modeling resources that we are confident have accounted for the latest observations and trends. As we continue developing our vehicle cost estimates, we may further investigate the sensitivity to other factors if it appears necessary.
Thank you, Andrew. The industry continues to change and move forward, even in the relatively short time period since our last workshop. Even cheaper batteries are being projected by more and more analysts, with some OEMs bolstering those projections with new announcements. Fuel cell stacks are getting smaller while also becoming more durable and lower cost, which leaves more space to increase hydrogen tank capacity. And non-battery components like motors and inverters continue to shrink in size while also getting cheaper and more efficient. We have gathered several sources to help inform our cost analysis, particularly for non-battery costs. We are using a suite of electrified vehicle teardown reports, including CARB's Ricardo hybrid and plug-in hybrid component teardown, UBS's Chevrolet Bolt EV teardown, and Monroe's 12 electric motor comparison, 6 inverter comparison, BMW i3, Chevrolet Bolt EV, and Tesla Model 3 comparison, as well as the full vehicle BMW i3, Tesla Model 3, and Tesla Model Y teardowns. We have continued our work with an analysis of US DOE funded tools and reports like BATPAC and the Strategic Analysis Fuel Cell Cost Analysis. Additionally, the National Academy of Sciences has recently released its assessment of technologies for improving light-duty fuel economy for 2025 to 2035 report. We have not had enough time to analyze and incorporate the findings of that work, but we'll do so shortly. The combination of teardowns and continued analysis of technology trends and costs has led us to some changes and additional results since our last workshop. Those include a refinement of non-battery costs bolstered by the all previously mentioned sources. We have also adjusted battery costs downward based on higher projected battery manufacturing volume and carrying forward that cost reduction rate out to 2035. From that work, we have been able to roll up battery and non-battery costs into incremental cost packages for BEVs, fuel cells, and plug-in hybrids for various vehicle classifications in the fleet. Here are the different categories that make up each of the different zero-emission vehicle technologies. For battery electric vehicles and fuel cell electric vehicles, those categories consist of a battery cost group, a non-battery component cost group, an engine delete cost, and a ZEV assembly cost reduction category. There are differences in the specifics of the makeup of these categories. For instance, a FCEV has fuel cell and tank costs in the non-battery component cost category and a smaller battery, while the BEVs have onboard chargers and larger batteries. The plug-in hybrid electric vehicles are more unique in that they still have battery and non-battery costs, just like the FCVs and BEVs, but they also maintain their internal combustion engine, so they do not get a delete engine cost. And due to their complexity, they do not get to claim the ZEV assembly cost reductions. One thing to note here is that there is not yet a category for costs related to our ZEV assurance measures. This is something that we are currently working to develop. Lastly, as we move into describing some of the specific costs we are using, it is important to note that all the costs in this presentation are estimated to be direct manufacturing costs to the OEM and are not the same amount that the OEM might be expected to increase the sales price or that a consumer might expect to pay for that vehicle. This is a chart displaying our updated projected battery pack costs in dollars per kilowatt hour from 2025 to 2035. The upper blue dotted line shows the fuel cell electric vehicle battery pack cost. It is quite a bit higher than the BEVs and plug-in hybrids on a dollar per kilowatt hour basis for a few reasons. First, the battery packs are very similar or even identical to conventional hybrid electric vehicles in some applications. This means that the battery cells used in those packs have a much higher power to energy ratio, and the battery packs themselves have a much lower total energy capacity in the range of 1 to 2 kilowatt hours. Second, the ratio of active battery cell material to inactive battery cell and pack materials is much lower than the PHEV and BEV battery packs. As mentioned in my technology update, we have adjusted battery pack costs downward based on higher projected battery manufacturing volume and applying that cost reduction rate out to 2035. The bottom red solid line on this chart represents our projected BEV battery costs, and the callout labels show a few specific years. We are projecting a battery cost of $100 per kilowatt hour in 2026, which declines to about $80 in 2030 and down to roughly $65 per kilowatt hour in 2035. PHEV battery packs, as shown by the purple dashed line, are roughly 30% higher than the battery electric pack costs on a $1 per kilowatt hour basis due to similar reasons as the fuel cells, although the effect is not nearly as drastic. I will hand it over to Andrew to walk through the next slide on the fuel cell system costs.
Thank you, Ryan. In developing our estimates for fuel cell electric vehicle incremental costs, we relied on two primary data sets. First, we relied on U.S. Department of Energy studies to specify the vehicle attributes for future fuel cell vehicles in all vehicle classes. Through its Hydrogen and Fuel Cell Technology Office, the U.S. DOE and partners complete research to advance the technology and commercialization of fuel cell and hydrogen storage systems for fuel cell vehicles. Periodically, the Argonne National Laboratory studies the estimated future fuel cell vehicle costs based on the latest and projected technology status. These studies utilize the model autonomy to specify the vehicle component specifications that are required to achieve expected vehicle performance in each vehicle classification. We have adopted the vehicle specifications from the 2020 analysis. In addition, system component costs are updated every year for the U.S. Department of Energy through a separate analysis completed by Strategic Analysis. We have worked with Strategic Analysis to obtain their most recent cost estimates for fuel cell and hydrogen storage systems. In particular, Strategic Analysis has provided estimates that include additional costs for high durability fuel cell systems that are not yet accounted for in prior publications. A key benefit of the Strategic Analysis cost models is that costs are provided as a function of annual production volume. This is an important aspect for accurate cost modeling of fuel cell vehicles, as these vehicles are still in the early stages of commercialization and production capacity is ramping up. The figure on the left illustrates the Strategic Analysis data. As shown, today's production volumes are estimated in the range of 10 to 30,000 units per year, with fuel cell system costs between approximately $75 and $150 per kilowatt. At the same time, the Strategic Analysis cost model does not provide estimates for future cost reductions due to technology development. The autonomy-based model does provide this information. We have therefore developed a cost model that relies on both autonomy and Strategic Analysis data and accounts for cost reductions due to technology advancement and increases in production volume. We have applied this model to a scenario that estimates that production volumes will be high as 50,000 units per year in 2025 and reach 500,000 units per year in 2035. We developed a scenario based on global announcements of current and expected fuel cell vehicle deployment volumes and recent evidence that light-duty fuel cell vehicle system technology can be deployed in other applications like medium and heavy-duty fuel cell electric vehicles.
Thank you, Andrew. So how do we take the costs and create packages that can be applied to different vehicles? On the left side of the slide, the pie chart shows California's fleet segmented into 5 categories of vehicles based on model year 2019 sales. Those categories include small cars, medium and large cars, small SUVs, medium and large SUVs, and pickups. We modeled ZEV packages that were sized for each of these vehicle classes, which further included a separation in each vehicle class for a standard version and a premium/high performance version. For example, there is a standard small car and a premium/high performance small car with separately sized ZEV technology packages. What do those different packages look like for each of the ZEV technologies, BEVs, PHEVs, and fuel cells? We first had to decide on an all-electric range for each technology. For BEVs, we landed on 300 miles for a base version and 400 miles for the premium/high performance variant. Consumers appear to want more range, and OEMs are responding by increasing range year over year, with 300 miles becoming the new baseline. Manufacturers could still offer lower or higher range variants to best fit their customer needs, but for this analysis, it is assumed that a typical standard vehicle would have 300 miles of range. Additionally, 300 miles is likely where a much broader portion of potential customers would consider a BEV in place of a traditional gasoline vehicle, and this range offers more flexibility for those consumers that don't have reliable home or workplace charging. For the premium models, where traditionally they may have used more powerful engines to achieve faster acceleration in addition to more luxurious features, we have assumed part of their distinction from lower cost models will be defined by directionally longer range. PHEV models were determined using a different rationale. In order to have confidence in high levels of reduced GHG and criteria pollutant emissions, PHEVs need longer range and bigger batteries to support higher power demands of non-blended operation. In other words, keeping the engine from starting under high torque demands by the consumer until the battery has been depleted. Taking into account future estimated technical advancements, we are starting at 50 miles of range for cars and small SUVs in 2025 and improving that to 70 miles in 2030. After 2030, the range remains constant, but the vehicle is projected to continue to get slightly more efficient, resulting in the battery getting correspondingly smaller. For larger SUVs and pickups, they start with 50 miles of range and grow to 60 miles by 2030. After 2030, just like with the cars and small SUVs, the vehicle is projected to get more efficient and the battery subsequently shrinks. For fuel cells, we are relying on the range modeled for the US DOE Vehicle Technology Office's analysis, which is 320 miles. Now that we have described some of the cost inputs and range assumptions we are using, I will now walk through what the output incremental costs look like for one example vehicle category, the medium and large SUV category. The graph shows costs for a medium SUV, all rolled up for 300-mile BEVs, 400-mile BEVs, fuel cells, and plug-in hybrids in model years 2026, 2030, and 2035. These are average incremental direct manufacturing costs to switch from a base ICE to one of the aforementioned ZEV technologies in the identified model year. On the y-axis is the incremental cost for each technology, and those are separated into each of the ZEV technologies on the x-axis. Another thing to note, as mentioned on the previous slide, is that the PHEV version increases from 50 to 60 miles of range by 2030, resulting in a smaller cost reduction from 2026 to 2030. Evident in the chart is that initial manufacturing costs for these various technologies on this class of vehicles still reflect an increase over a gasoline vehicle, even with our current best cost estimates for the various components which make up each vehicle ZEV technology. Things like batteries, fuel cell stacks, motors, etc. These costs are not a determinant of a specific price increase to a consumer for a new car, and they do not incorporate any operating costs or savings from fuel, electricity, or maintenance. As noted earlier, we will be including all those aspects in our final rulemaking proposal as part of the overall costs and benefits to society and consumers. Acknowledging that the base ZEV and PHEV technologies shown in the previous slides are not fully representative of consumer preferences for certain technology attributes, we have further developed additional technology packages that are added on top of the base PHEVs, BEVs, and FCEVs to meet the needs of consumers in higher uptake ZEV scenarios. To explain, a single vehicle of each ZEV technology and each vehicle size class is not representative of the diversity of the market. Consumers have preferences to operate their vehicles in various ways, which require additional technology. For example, about 10% of California's vehicle fleet resides in areas that experience at least one full 24-hour period with temperatures below 35 degrees Fahrenheit. While FCEVs and PHEVs would not be as adversely affected by the temperature or could quickly refuel if required, BEVs cannot. To address this issue, we created a technology package for BEVs to assist in colder climates, which includes a more efficient heat pump and additional battery heating components. Consumers also sometimes buy larger SUVs and pickups to meet towing needs. Towing adversely affects range of any vehicle due to the increased mass the powertrain must move and reductions in aerodynamic efficiency to the vehicle from the trailer. This is not necessarily much of an issue with FCEVs and PHEVs because they can fully refuel as quickly as conventional vehicles and would likely incur no more refueling stops on a trip than a conventional vehicle. For BEVs, however, even charging at a very high rate of 350 kilowatts, recharging times are lengthier and cannot restore the full range. To address consumers' towing needs with towing-capable BEVs, we modeled additive towing packages for BEVs that adds enough battery capacity such that the vehicle can complete a 440-mile one-way trip when towing a load that cuts efficiency in half and only requires one 20-minute charging stop at 350 kilowatts. Lastly, consumers purchase many vehicles with all-wheel drive or four-wheel drive. We put together a corresponding electric all-wheel drive / four-wheel drive package for BEVs, fuel cells, and non-truck-based PHEV cars and SUVs, which adds an additional electric motor at the undriven axle and all the necessary components to go along with it. Larger PHEV SUVs and pickups do not require additional motor because it is assumed that many will utilize a P2 style electric drive system that will operate through a conventional truck-based four-wheel drive system. So how do these additive technology packages get distributed in our example case of the medium and large SUVs? On the left is the pie chart we have shown earlier in this presentation, except that it now has a more granular bar chart breakdown of the medium and large SUV category on the right to illustrate where the technology additive packages would fit. These percentages represent the specific technology grouping as a portion of the total fleet, such that if you summed all the percentages listed in the bar chart on the right, they would add up to the approximately 10% of total sales that medium and large SUVs make up. On the top part of the bar chart area are the base package vehicles. These would be 300-mile BEVs or less powerful PHEVs and fuel cells. For medium SUVs, these are a small portion of the market. The rest of the bar chart below encapsulates all the premium package variants. These would be the higher performing PHEVs and fuel cells and longer range 400-mile BEVs. For example, 2.5% of the total market are all-wheel drive, premium, medium, and large SUVs. Each of these different subcategories incurs a different cost for the most part, even if they were all BEVs, fuel cells, or plug-in hybrids. So what do these costs look like when applied to the different ZEV technologies? This chart shows the various additive technologies and their respective incremental costs for medium and large SUVs in 2030. For simplicity, we have omitted the 400-mile BEV costs, but you can imagine that those will be proportionally higher than the 300-mile BEV, except in the case where the towing package drives up the size of the batteries of both options to similar capacities. On the y-axis is the incremental cost, and on the x-axis, the different ZEV technologies are grouped with each bar representing a variation or additive package on that ZEV technology. The legend at the upper right shows the different combinations of packages, which includes a base version, a cold weather package, an all-wheel drive package coupled with a cold package, a tow package, a towing and all-wheel drive package, and lastly, a towing plus all-wheel drive plus cold package. You may have noticed that there is no all-wheel drive package by itself. Those are always coupled with either the cold weather package and or a towing package due to the increased accelerator traction offered by all-wheel drive. You may have also noticed that not all of the packages add costs, such as the case with FCEVs and PHEVs. That is because additive cold weather or towing packages are not required for those ZEV technologies because they can refuel quickly and consumers are not as affected when in cold weather or while towing. So here are the costs for the same set of technologies again for the medium and large SUV category, but this time for 2035. Costs are lower in every case, but towing packages on BEVs still add significant costs despite the roughly $65 per kilowatt hour battery cost projected for 2035. The same methodology discussed previously applies to the other four categories of vehicles as well: small cars, medium large cars, small SUVs, and pickups. The costs vary from vehicle type to vehicle type, but the trends shown here are the same in those other cases. Adding additional technology packages adds additional cost. So CARB staff have made significant progress on the ZEV cost projections. However, there are some areas that we are seeking additional data on. While we have some costs established for ICE powertrains, we think there is more work to be done in this space, and additional data could help to hone in our analysis and incremental costs. Currently, we are using tentative engine delete costs that we have been developing with US EPA, but this may be an opportunity for refinement because these cost values were intended to be for incremental additive ICE technologies cost analysis and not necessarily for complete ICE powertrain removal and cost accounting. Further, given the current review of the federal GHG standards through 2026 model year, there is some uncertainty as of today as to what additional incremental costs may be projected for gasoline going forward that would need to be accounted for when comparing future ZEV costs to future gasoline vehicle costs. Another area that we are seeking more data on is ZEV assembly costs. We have a value for BEVs and fuel cells, but more data would help to refine these values and ensure that we are accurately capturing the potential cost reductions for simpler and easier to assemble vehicles in the future. We're also seeking additional data on projections for efficiency improvements across all ZEV platforms. Much of the previous analysis done has been based on what a converted ICE platform could do from an efficiency standpoint. It would be helpful to better understand what future projected efficiencies could be for non-ICE based vehicles so that we can better project battery sizes for those future vehicles. Finally, we are also looking for additional data to help develop our cost accounting for the ZEV assurance measures that will be proposed in the next section. Please keep that in mind when listening and watching the next part of this workshop. We mentioned in the previous slide that we were seeking input on ICE delete costs and ZEV assembly cost reductions. Here, we are showing the values assigned to those cost reductions. BEVs and FCEVs on dedicated platforms are easier to assemble and reduce assembly plant floor space requirements relative to their conventional ICE counterparts. The table in the lower left corner shows the cost reduction assigned to BEVs and fuel cells. BEVs, being the most simple of the two, get the larger reduction, while FCEVs, still being simpler than ICEs in many ways, but not as simple as a BEV, get half of the BEV reduction. In the lower right side of this slide is a table showing the engine delete costs for smaller and larger categories of vehicles. These delete costs are meant to capture modern day internal combustion engine, transmission, and all related components that are not needed on BEVs or FCEVs, which includes other items like the gasoline tank, fuel lines, emission controls, etc. The delete cost is less for smaller vehicles because they generally use smaller components including the engine, after treatment, etc. Within the next few weeks, CARB staff anticipate releasing the ZEV cost modeling workbook for public feedback. As Anna expressed earlier, we are also hoping to hear more from you all about how best to ensure our regulations achieve equitable outcomes. Keep this in mind as you review the ZEV technology assumptions we are using for our cost modeling. For example, consider if we are capturing the appropriate vehicle ranges to match community needs. We will also continue to refine our ZEV technology packages and costs based on new data as it becomes available. As I have mentioned, a more complete analysis of the overall costs and benefits to society and consumers for the proposed regulatory scenario is another facet that we will be working on, and we'll use that to help guide the proposed regulation. With that, we have finished the ZEV technology trends and cost portion of the presentation. Before I hand it over to Anna to present on the ZEV assurance measures portion of this presentation, we will pause to answer some of your questions.
Thanks, Ryan. And actually, we're going to pause first for another poll. So I'm going to launch that, and then Shobna's going to start with the questions.
Okay, some of these I think are just easy clarifying questions, Ryan, so I'll read them off and then you can answer. First one in slide 61, what is the battery chemistry for the cost? What chemistry do you expect to be used for the 300 to 400 mile EVs?
So the predominant costs, or the predominant chemistry that we've modeled so far, specifically for EVs, is NMC 811.
Okay. And then I know, Simon, you had this question, but I think Ryan answered it in the presentation, but I just want to make sure, you know, in the assumption that all BEVs will be between 300 and 400 mile, do the ZEV projections assume some mix of 150, 200, 250, and even 450 plus mile BEVs? Also, what do the total cost of ownership estimates look like? So just a quick comment on the TCO analysis. We will be doing that as part of our full economic impact assessment, and that'll be presented probably in the October timeframe, or maybe even in our next workshop here. So this cost that we're presenting is just for vehicle incremental price. So Ryan, do you want to add a little bit more to the 300 and 400 mile? It's an average range. Go ahead,
it's an average range in those vehicle categories. So kind of like we alluded to in the presentation, there can be different models offered at different ranges, but we expect the average to hover around those values in those vehicle segments.
Okay. And then we have another question that I think we answered. It was probably posted right before the slide, just on cold weather and temperature impacts on range. Has the range modeling considered any temperature, weather impacts, in particular colder weather in northern Section 177 states? So we did present a larger battery and a different cost for a cold weather package. And I'll let Ryan add a little bit more, but I just want to point out that, you know, when we come back to you in our next workshop, we will be looking at kind of the fleet as a whole and what percentage of those, you know, cold weather packages will be applied for the California fleet will probably be different than what it would be for the Section 177 states. But we will be providing a spreadsheet of all of our costs, so that, you know, if you are looking at costs in the Section 177 states or a colder weather area, then, you know, the fleet might have more of those costs associated with that fleet. So Ryan, do you want to add more to that?
Yeah, so I would just say the cold weather packages haven't added necessarily additional battery capacity to mitigate range effects. The cold weather range effects are mitigated through the addition of a heat pump and additional battery heating. So in an attempt to try to make sure that the vehicle isn't as adversely impacted by the cold weather.
Okay, and next question is also about battery chemistries. Does this additional tech packages cost for BEVs in 2035 take into account the change in battery chemistries in 2035?
So it's a little bit more complicated, but we are essentially expecting sort of conventional lithium ion to carry out to 2030, and it's kind of in line with what the US DOE has been kind of recently saying as well, is that that sort of gets us to the $80 per kilowatt hour. And then after that, after 2035, we're expecting continued reductions in cost, but they're going to come from additional technologies. It's the issue is that the modeling tools that we have to do that don't have any like options for those newer technologies, like a solid state cell with a pure lithium anode or something like that. So we're sort of relying on the continued cost reduction trends to get us out to 2035, which is in line with what we're hearing from US DOE and then what was also in the recent NIS report. And so we're kind of all aligned on those things.
Okay, next question. Ryan, this is going to be a lot for you, so I'm just going to assume you answer them. Did you take into account possible resource constraints in the future that may occur in the future affecting battery costs? Will we have plenty of lithium, chromium, etc. for our battery needs?
So I think we're probably going to cover this a little bit later in some of the battery recycling proposal pieces, but yeah, I'll leave. And Mike or Shobna, or Anna, if you have additional things to add here, I think we're going to talk about that a little bit more. But we also have looked at kind of total battery capacity of California in a 100% scenario and how that compares to the projected world manufacturing throughput, and it's not a large percentage of that.
Okay. Next question, are the costs on slide 61 assuming different production volumes? 4.5% per year reduction given the massive shift in production volumes over that decade seems quite low. Do you want to go to slide 61?
I think Anna has control now, so.
Okay.
This is the right slide, right?
Yes. Okay. Sorry, I was trying to shift to the slide as well so I could see it. What? So yeah, if you could read it again. My apologies.
And I didn't get it. So did you take into account possible resource? Oh, I'm sorry. Are the costs on slide 61 assuming different production volumes?
Yeah, I mean, yes. So it takes into account two things. So we modeled battery production using BATPAC and looked at the cost reductions based on volume, and then applied an additional learning to that as well. So it's a combination of the two factors.
Okay. And I don't think we covered this in the slide deck, but what maximum charge rates do you assume for BEVs? 50 kilowatt, 100 kilowatt, 150 kilowatt, or 350 kilowatt? And that's assuming, obviously, how you're charging it. So
yeah, so we haven't incorporated charge rates into the like cost of the vehicles to adjust the battery, I guess, battery design to necessarily account for those. We assume that they can charge at the maximum rates. So especially with the towing vehicles and that exercise, we have we assume that they could do at 350 kilowatts, and partially that's due to the relatively large size of the batteries, that it's a relatively low power demand as a function of C rate of the battery pack. So yeah, additional data on that would also be helpful on the impacts of fast charging on the battery pack designs.
Okay. The next question, what modeling platform are you using for cost assessment, if any? Is it the Argonne's autonomy model for BEVs and plug-in hybrids as well?
Do you want me to take that, Mike, or? Yeah, I can answer a little bit about it. So basically, we're not using autonomy to generate the attributes of the BEVs and plug-in hybrids. That's done based on a kind of what we covered a little bit in the presentation. So that was a combination of looking at current vehicle offerings, what the efficiencies are of those vehicles, and then projecting out future improvements in the time period that we're looking at for this proposed regulation. And then also using all the teardown data that we have, all the reports that I mentioned previously, and that has helped us to generate a lot of the non-battery costs which go into the BEVs and plug-in hybrids. And we're also using those non-battery costs for the fuel cells as well, and apportioning the components appropriately. Like a fuel cell won't have an onboard charger, or a plug-in hybrid might have a different sized, will have a different size inverter for a lower or higher power motor relative to a similar BEV.
Okay, Mike, did you want to add anything to that? And I can go to the next question.
No, I think Ryan covered it.
Okay, so this one is for Andrew. Andrew, with hydrogen retail prices in the $20 per kilogram range, and the past 25 years, utility prices, price example for CNG compression costs suggesting future retail hydrogen prices to continue to move upwards of $30 per kilogram in real dollars. This fuel cost factor should dominate the future consumer acceptance or lack thereof for fuel cell vehicles. Forecasting need to test this concept in and
yeah. So a key thing to remember is with the light-duty hydrogen retail fueling network right now, it is an early market, and it's a market that's developing. It's still growing economies of scale, et cetera. It is true that the historical average has been around $16 per kilogram. However, we are seeing, with more stations coming online, with more of those stations being larger, having 4 fueling positions, being able to essentially have more opportunity to generate revenue, they are reducing their prices. Some of the latest stations that opened have reduced prices to $12 per kilogram. And an interesting thing to keep in mind is that at around $8 per kilogram, you're at price parity with gasoline. We do a lot of work in coordinating with industry, coordinating with other state agencies on hydrogen infrastructure, doing a lot of analyses, and we are tracking the costs. We do actually expect costs to reduce, not increase, mostly because of there's still a lot of room to grow essentially for this industry. So as we get more stations out there, there's more opportunity to reduce operational costs. You can essentially share operational costs like drivers for transporting the fuel, maintenance operators, et cetera, across more stations that are more densely located near each other. So that helps with the economics. We have actually done an economic analysis of different scenarios for growing the station network out through 2035. We have a draft report out now, and we're finalizing a final version of that to be released soon. And we also do see actually several other resources, seeing a lot of opportunity for cost reduction for hydrogen, and not only for conventionally produced hydrogen, but also for for hydrogen from completely renewable sources. Resources like Bloomberg New Energy Finance and others have actually done a lot of in-depth, detailed analysis and see the opportunity for hydrogen to become actually pretty competitive on a price basis. We do, of course, know that that's going to be a factor in the consumer demand for hydrogen fueled vehicles, and so I think similar to a prior question that I'm sure that those questions will be looked at during the TCO analysis, but if Shobna or anybody else who is more connected to that particular work can fill in for that.
Okay, I think that was the last question. We have one more actually. What assumptions do you make about world EV production volumes for battery critical minerals such as cobalt, lithium, etc.? While California may be a small part of the world production could affect critical mineral availability and therefore battery costs. Ryan, do you want to take that?
Yeah, so I think probably talk a little bit more about this in the battery recycling piece later on. We haven't really connected, other than battery production volume, kind of the critical material piece to that yet in terms of the modeling, but it's something we're looking at on the battery recycling side and the availability of critical minerals. And so I think you're going to hear more about that later in the workshop here.
And I'll take the last questions. And I know that there are probably a lot more questions people have once they look at the spreadsheet that we post. So we totally understand. I think people want to look at details here. Last question for Andrew. What is the difference in cost between non-renewable and renewable-based hydrogen?
Yeah, that can depend on a number of factors. I believe that some of the most recent estimates are that it can be about $5 to $8 more per kilogram. But that is really heavily dependent on the production volume you're talking about, where you're getting your renewable resources from, how far it has to be transmitted, distributed, etc. A key thing to note, though, is even at the prices that we see today, California's hydrogen fueling network is at least about 40% renewable already. That's due to the requirements in the state co-funding programs that we have. And we actually did have reporting that last year, for much of the year, the network was actually able to maintain up 100%, well, nearly 100%, I believe it was 90% renewable implementation while keeping those same prices at the pump for the consumer. So it is a complex question. It's still a developing market, but we do see, based on a lot of in-depth analysis, that there is opportunity for these costs to come down in the future.
Hey, and I spoke too soon, Ryan. Last question. Do modeling costs for inverters include bidirectional inverters?
So we haven't included that. That's purely because we don't have any data or information to direct what those costs might be. So based on all of the teardown information that we have so far, none of those vehicles have a bidirectional inverter on them, from what I understand. So if somebody has information that they can supply that we can use, we would like to see it. It would be helpful, because it would be something that we could add on, or at least help to incorporate within our non-battery component costs.
Okay, thanks, Ryan and Andrew. And again, thank you very much for your questions. If you have additional questions, please send those to us through email.
Okay, so before Anna goes on to the ZEV assurance measures, I'm just going to share the poll results. So looks like these webinars and workshops are very popular, so we'll continue to do those. And for the email updates, just a plug again that if you haven't subscribed to our email list, there'll be a link at the end that will help you get those. Okay, so I'll pass it back to Anna here.
Okay, we have 2 more sections, everybody. There's 400 of you still hanging on, and I'm really impressed by that. Just in case you forgot what I look like, I want to say hello to everybody again. In September, we presented the concept and preliminary proposals related to these ZEV assurance measures. The intention of these proposals are to remove barriers to adoption while ensuring ZEVs can meet the needs of consumers. So in staff's estimate, reaching California's 100% goal would be entirely impossible without ensuring appropriate minimum durability, warranty, and serviceability requirements are in place for ZEVs going forward. I want to take a minute just to remind you why we believe these measures are so important. First and foremost, ZEVs are the technology we need to fully transform the light-duty vehicle fleet to meet California's criteria pollutant and greenhouse gas emission reduction goals. But these cannot be just second or third vehicles within a small percentage of households. Instead, we need consumers to begin to replace each of their gasoline vehicles with ZEVs. And measures like durability, warranty, and serviceability help to hold all vehicles to a level that consumers have come to expect. And I'm not just talking about replacing a new car buyer's gasoline vehicle. I'm talking about transforming every Californian's gasoline vehicle, most of whom buy used vehicles. And while the ZEV regulation can help ensure volumes of new cars, each of the measures being proposed today is meant to ensure all Californians' unique travel needs are met, especially those in priority populations who may have less access to charging and longer commutes. We also believe demystifying ZEVs by increasing transparency will help to build consumer confidence in ZEVs. Current drivers have a right to understand the vehicle's needs for repair and warranty qualifications, and prospective drivers, especially in the used vehicle market, should have the ability to evaluate the health of the battery within these vehicles. We also believe that we need to think about the entire spectrum of vehicle usage within California, which means bringing along the vehicle repair industry as we transition to the new technology. Repair technicians, especially in independent technicians, need to be able to access vehicle data to assess the vehicle's need for repair. Lastly, we cannot ignore the need or the role that infrastructure plays, especially as the market expands beyond single-family homeowners to those who might be more dependent on public fast charging. As a note, in September, we actually proposed standardizing the fast charge inlet on 2026 and subsequent model year vehicles, and that proposal is still available to view on our website, and we're not going to be providing additional updates to that today. So before I even launch into any of these requirements, it's important to understand how CARB approaches vehicle durability and warranty requirements for gasoline vehicles before we discuss the proposals for ZEVs. So when a gasoline vehicle is certified in California, its criteria pollutant and greenhouse gas emissions are tested and verified, not only when the vehicle is new, but data and testing is required to show the vehicles can maintain those same emission levels over the life of the vehicle, which today is 15 years or 150,000 miles. This is called the vehicle's useful life standard. This standard applies to the manufacturer's entire fleet of vehicles and ensures the robust design of each test group. Manufacturers are also required to test in-use vehicles within each test group as the cars age to verify that they continue to meet the standard over their life. CARB also carries out such testing, and if a representative sample of vehicles within a test group indicates the test group as a whole has a problem, CARB can require appropriate remedies to bring that test group into compliance with the standard. Now I'm going to switch to warranty. Warranty, on the other hand, is meant to ensure OEMs are responsible for emission component failures on individual vehicles. And warranty failures on individual vehicles do not constitute any sort of non-compliance or recall jeopardy. However, when partnered with warranty reporting, pattern emission-related component defects early in the vehicle's life can be more readily identified, which in turn can inform CARB's in-use testing for that particular test group. Just to be clear, these regulations have never applied to zero-emission vehicles, only to plug-in hybrids. However, these are important regulations that are in work in the background to ensure all manufacturers are held to a similar design level. In our estimation, applying useful life standards and warranty regulations to ZEVs is essential in laying the groundwork for transitioning the fleet to 100% electrification by 2035. I cannot underscore how quickly technology has developed in this space. Just 10 years ago, we were all here back in this space, in this workshop space, pinning our hopes on 100-mile BEVs. Now, every manufacturer has introduced, or at the very least, has announced plans to release ZEVs with batteries and fuel cells with ranges comparable to those in gasoline vehicles. You can see that in the analysis Ryan and Andrew just showed. Shown in laboratory testing, as well as reported by vehicle manufacturers themselves, batteries continue to improve, even as costs come down and the market grows to a less forgiving segment of the population. For fuel cells, durability remains one of the largest technical barriers, but there have been continued progress in recent years. The industry adopted standard for acceptable fuel cell system durability in an automotive application is no more than a 10% loss in output system power. The near-term U.S. Department of Energy target is to maintain this level of performance through 5,000 hours of operation, with a long-term target to achieve 8,000 hours of operation. Both targets are based on providing equivalent durability to conventional vehicles with 150,000-mile durability. The longer 8,000-hour durability is expected to be more representative of a wider range of real-world driving cycles and consumer driving behaviors than the 5,000-hour target. In 2015, state-of-the-art fuel cell systems for automotive applications were reported to achieve 2,500 hours of operation while meeting industry-accepted durability standards. Now, the latest estimates from the U.S. Department of Energy for state-of-the-art systems indicate more than 60% improvement, with up to 4,100 hours of durability. This improvement in durability is also evidenced by the warranties manufacturers are offering on these vehicles. On these two charts, we plotted powertrain and battery warranties by year and mileage for BEVs. You can see there are different size bubbles, and the size of the bubble corresponds to the number of sales associated with the warranty being offered at the time of sale. As you can see, this is a competitive space where many manufacturers are offering warranties beyond what that's even offered for gasoline vehicles, many at 10 years or 100,000 miles, and even more for both powertrain components and batteries. This indicates that durability for these components is far beyond these levels manufacturers are actually willing to warrant. When I add fuel cell vehicles, you can see manufacturers are offering competitive warranties in this space as well, both to themselves and to battery electric vehicles. Staff believe it is the appropriate time to build upon these advancements in battery and fuel cell technology and set a useful life standard for all 2026 and subsequent model year ZEVs. Staff proposes battery electric vehicle test groups must be designed to maintain 80% of the certified test range, we call that UDDS range, for 15 years or 150,000 miles, whichever occurs first. Fuel cell vehicle test groups must be designed to maintain at least 90% of fuel cell system output after 4,000 hours of operation. Equally as important as these performance criteria is how compliance with these standards will be determined at a test group level. Staff is considering how in-use compliance testing works, including aspects for manufacturer self-testing and CARB-procured vehicle testing, where traditionally a representative sample of vehicles is tested in the lab and determined if a test group on average fails. Are these approaches the appropriate way to enforce a range or hour-based standard? Also, it is important when developing the follow-on testing proposal to consider what would be the scope of the appropriate remedies. For example, a BEV test group were to fail due to an excessive battery degradation. Should all vehicles in that test group be subjected to a remedy, or only those vehicles that are actually below the threshold? Should the remedy be limited to no more than what is necessary to return the vehicles in that test group to an appropriate level of range given the age and mileage? What kind of interim release may be appropriate in early years of such requirements to encourage appropriate design while manufacturers continue to refine their knowledge and design in the area of durability? Staff is seeking comment on all in this area to ensure the durability requirement does as intended, which is to hold manufacturers to a robust design standard that'll mitigate consumer concerns without adding undue burden and costs onto manufacturers. As for the individual vehicles, staff is proposing a bifurcated approach to minimum warranties for ZEVs. Staff proposes a manufacturer provide a minimum warranty of 3 years or 50,000 miles, or 7 years, 70,000 miles for high-priced parts for all powertrain components, excluding the traction battery. But for the traction batteries and BEVs, staff proposes the same warranty length as is required for plug-in hybrids earning ZEV credit, which is 10 years or 150,000 miles. However, in practice, this warranty has had little effect on plug-in hybrids because the warranty coverage isn't explicitly linked to any metric. Therefore, staff proposes the warranty for traction batteries be linked to the battery's state of health metric that was proposed in September, and that I'll actually be providing an update on in just a couple of slides. The level to which the battery is warranted can still be set by the manufacturer, but whatever level is used, it must be linked to the state of health and disclosed at the time of certification and to the consumer. In addition to the minimum warranty length, staff proposes battery electric vehicles and fuel cells be included into the same warranty reporting requirements applicable to gasoline vehicles and plug-in hybrids. I want to note that all existing requirements for plug-in hybrids will remain in place, and that these would be in addition to those. Okay, let's turn our attention to how ZEVs need to fit into California's car ecosystem. Though ZEVs will likely need fewer repairs than gasoline vehicles, the sheer number of vehicles in California are clearly not able to be serviced by new dealers alone. According to the latest census data, there are over 10,000 independent repair locations in California, as compared to the 2,000 new vehicle dealers who may provide service for vehicles. This is where California's longstanding service information rule plays an important role in the background. This rule currently requires emission-related repair information to be available to non-dealer technicians at a fair and reasonable price. Also, tooling required to access on-vehicle information is also required to be available to non-dealers. Thinking through a future dominated by ZEVs that are exempt from this requirement, there could be significant risks to the aftermarket repair industry and the vehicle owners that rely on those service providers. Not only are independent technicians not guaranteed to have access to the information, community colleges where much of the training occurs don't have access to this information. This training is essential to preparing the workforce for such a transition as this. Therefore, staff is proposing to require the same access and disclosure of repair information as required by Section 1969 for gasoline vehicles. For ZEVs, this will be information for propulsion-related component repairs. As with gasoline vehicles, manufacturers will be required to comply with the same tooling standardization requirements to be able to reprogram vehicle ECUs. As a reminder to what was presented in September, staff is requiring standardized data related to the vehicle's usage as well as to access propulsion-related fault codes. CARB is proposing vehicles to be equipped with a standardized data connector and follow standardized communication protocols to be able to access this subset of information on the vehicle. I'm going to refer you back to the September workshop presentation for further information about the data fields CARB is looking to standardize. Those are available on our website. Another update to staff's September proposal is the battery state of health metric. The purpose of this metric is to disclose to the driver and to a technician the actual battery state of health over the life of the vehicle. Staff have updated their thinking around this metric and now propose for battery state of health to be tied to usable battery energy as opposed to battery capacity. Staff believes this metric better gets at what energy is available to actually power the vehicle. As a reminder to what was presented in September, this metric would be determined by SAE the SAE standard J1634 dyno testing, which would be within a 5% accuracy, of what is determined to that test. Staff also is proposing this parameter to be normalized on a 0 to 100% scale, so it's always referenced back to when the vehicle and its battery was new. Lastly, staff proposes that in addition to the state of health being available and accessed by a standardized tool, the communication protocol, this metric be able to be accessed by a driver without the use of a standardized tool, and that this metric be the one that is linked back to that minimum warranty requirement that I just discussed. That ends this part of the presentation, and I'm happy to take questions.
Before you do that, Anna, we're going to run one more poll.
Okay.
So as it's been alluded to during the presentation, we really are trying to focus more on environmental justice issues. So this is a specific question relating to that. But Shobna, yeah, if you want to start with the questions while this is going, I think we can do both at the same time.
Okay. All right. So we do have a positive comment here, which I'm going to read out loud because it's good to hear this. We nailed it. What is necessary to get used vehicle market activated on slide 74, Anna. So good job. And then the next question I'm going to give to Joshua. By 2035, what proportion of new vehicle sales will be electric vehicles? What proportion will be fuel cell electric vehicles?
Yes, thank you, Shobna. Joshua Cunningham here. You know, as in the past with the ZEV regulation for compliance in the pure ZEV category, we do not want to dictate how automakers comply. We encourage fuel cell vehicles and battery electric vehicles to be used in the market and sold to customers based on the needs of the market. And we don't intend to change that going forward for the next ZEV regulation in the pure ZEV category. We do in our scenario work make assumptions purely for the scenario perspective to make estimates on the electricity and fuel demands. But for the regulation, we will not micromanage that.
Okay. And the next question, slide 80 to 83, is my understanding correct that there will be no efficiency or monitoring requirements like in CCR 1968-2 today for BEVs in ACC2, that there will be just a standardization in data and tools to support independent repair shops and extra output of battery state of health and the special warranty requirement? Mike?
Yes, that is correct for the proposal today. We are not proposing to do the level of required diagnostics like the OBD2 reg you cited for BEVs and fuel cells. We think manufacturers are well aware of the diagnostic needs. We have, it is a different situation. We didn't just apply the gasoline situation to BEVs. We think it warrants a step back there. And but we obviously, as Anna said, need to ensure service can still happen if service is reasonable. Can't afford going back to sort of a wild, wild west of requirements for repair technicians to try to stay abreast of tools and technology and terminology. So that's why we've tried to carve out a little minimum standardization, but not get into the level of mandating and overseeing every single component that must be diagnosed and to what level it must be diagnosed.
Okay. And we have a couple other questions kind of relating to this. For required standardization for vehicle data, do you consider the option of OTA?
So we have, for OTA and over the air, we need to talk about that. So certainly at this point, we're not proposing to standardize anything relative to OTA or over the air reprogramming. Generally, everything we're aware of, there is still a mechanism to recover and be able to reprogram at least some of the vehicle ECUs, propulsion-related ECUs, or central computer through a tool and not through over the air. So in that case, it may be as simple as just having to worry about that one remaining sort of central module or the module that helps you recover in the case where it is your primary module that is in part of over the air updating or something like that. So I think we can talk about it and plan for it, but I think that might provide achieve what we're trying to achieve, which is in that rare case that you need to do that one sort of hardline reprogram event, it can be done in something like a J2534 compliant tooling and format.
Okay, and related to that same diagnostics here, is there a fear that without the regulation, new manufacturers won't adhere to the current standards for diagnostics?
Yes, there is definitely a fear of that, especially with, I think it's less of a fear with legacy manufacturers that are having to do this in the gasoline world and transitioning over because they have sufficient, investment in infrastructure in what they've been doing. But as you know, we also have newer players to this that are not traditional legacy manufacturers that don't have that and may have found other more cost-effective solutions in their minds. So there is a concern of trying not to go back to a system where repair technicians are in a massive tooling war every year trying to stay abreast of what's required to talk to different brands that they service, even when they specialize in just a few brands.
Okay, on state of health, the 5% accuracy is relative to what? That's one of the questions.
Usable battery energy as measured during the J1634 test.
Okay, did staff consider reserve usable battery capacity when developing the 80% UDDS certified range warranty requirement? Is it possible the requirement could drive excess UBE reserve on slide 79? So I don't know, Anna, if you want to go to slide 79 first, that way we can. Okay.
Certainly, we have debated this, tried it quite a bit internally. We've had discussion with a few manufacturers. It might be part of somebody's solution if they really don't have the confidence to that they can stave off degradation. We've seen some plug-in hybrids do a little bit of this to stave off degradation because of the full useful life greenhouse gas standards, that they have to sort of maintain range or else certify at a higher CO2 level to reflect the full useful life battery there. We have not really seen that in BEVs yet, but it's certainly a possibility that somebody could look at that as part of the way to mitigate this. That's not something that we mandate or discourage, encourage or discourage. That's the manufacturer's choice, and just like they have today, and how they decide to sort of manage degradation in the field. We are trying to the extent that people do this, it can affect the SOH parameter. So we are trying to plan for that in the sort of design of that SOH parameter so that we're actually still communicating a usable, meaningful number to consumers. So if that SOH metric is sort of blind to the reserve capacity, then it sort of undermines the ability to be transparent and communicate any sort of degradation to the consumer on that battery. So we are trying to plan for it there. And like I said, it may be part of somebody's solution for meeting customer demands or requirements for degradation.
Okay. There's a question here for battery swap vehicles. Consumers' fleets will not own the batteries. The model is battery as a service. Battery swap will cover a lot of the use cases of fuel cells and resolve issues surrounding charging speed. Have you considered how this fits into your assurance measures? And I encourage others to answer this, but I would say, I think it's a really intriguing concept of battery swap. I know that there's one business that has reached out to us for that. I think we definitely need to figure out, even for certification, where they fall. So, there's a lot of, we would like to have more conversations about, how this vehicle would be, if it's a new vehicle, if it would be, so we do need to figure out how this would certify first and then how it fits into our regulations. But we're very open to hearing more ideas and your business case, because right now there isn't a company that offers that or is part of, kind of our OEMs. So I don't know, Mike, Anna, and Joshua, anybody else wanted to answer that?
This is Joshua. Shobna, I think you answered it well. We would look forward to more conversations on that. Like she said, we have talked to one company that is a prospective battery swap company, but we have not seen that in the market yet. And we'll want to think this through with more conversations.
Okay. And we have another question that says, has CARB considered the potential battery degradation that occurs as a result of V2G activity, vehicle to grid activity? I don't think we have, but I'll let, I don't know, Joshua, if you have anything to add to that.
Can you ask the question again, Shobna?
Sure. Has CARB considered the potential battery degradation that occurs as a result of vehicle to grid activity?
I don't think we have quantification of that right now. We are, as a team, tracking the vehicle grid integration work plan for the state and coordinating with the sister agencies. So we're aware of the potential policies and actions that'll be coming forward. So I think generally we would rely on automakers to make sure that they're thinking through the use of their vehicles as they consider any requirements we have on warranty and durability. But we don't have quantification at this point on the specific impacts from batteries for those different profiles.
And this, Mike, I'll just add as well that CARB is aware of the work that's going on with the UN EV committee, right? And that they've been looking at battery durability and different kind of state of health metrics and stuff like that. And certainly the question has come up there whether there's something that we need to capture data on how often it's happening, or be able to translate that into something. Because obviously we have no intention of somebody be able to try to take claim a 1-year-old car and that has 5,000 miles on it, but has been used aggressively and extensively for some sort of grid energy storage and release of energy all the time, and call that normal wear and tear on a 5,000 mile car or something like that. So at least that the UN group is trying to work with something. Maybe there's something that we can track, sort of an energy flow parameter or something like that, and translate it to an equivalent, so that to the extent that becomes a thing that is being done, we can account for it and not end up penalizing a manufacturer who, for vehicles that with equivalent mileage, have had a lot more battery usage at that point or something like that. So we are at least aware of that work there. I think that may be one of the prudent moves early on, is just to be able to put some data in there that's tracking it to the extent it happens, so that we can then figure out how much of an impact it has on degradation and factor that in when you're testing cars or looking at cars.
Okay, that's all the questions we had in this section, which actually makes us in time, so that's great. And again, if you have any other questions after this presentation or after the workshop that you think of, feel free to email us. We'll move on to the next presenter.
Okay, so let me just share the poll results first on our informal work group. So it looks like, moderate interest. So that's something we'll pursue, and you should watch the email list for announcements of those meetings if we're going to have them. Okay, and now let me switch to So Alejandro now is going to be presenting on our battery recycling proposal.
Hi, everyone. Thank you. I know it's a long day, and I appreciate all the presenters that have come before. So I want to talk a bit about a proposal here related to battery recycling, but first take a step back and kind of orient on on some important background information. I can go ahead and get the next slide, please. Okay, so there are a number of key issues that we see as relevant to battery recycling, particularly to support wider scale adoption of EVs in a sustainable manner. So given projected growth in the number of electric vehicles that are on the road today, we expect a large scale retirement of electric vehicle batteries to begin in the next 5 to 10 years. And while the supply of mineral resources for batteries is unlikely to limit manufacturing in the near term, in the long term, recycling of these materials is going to be increasingly critical. And there could be a number of barriers to impede the success of a robust recycling program. In particular, the infrastructure required to handle the various steps in a recycling system, and sufficient knowledge about the composition of batteries in order to enable a highly efficient process. So further, if the value of recovered materials is too low, it's going to be difficult to encourage the necessary capital investment to develop the infrastructure in the system. And certainly battery reuse and vehicle-to-grid integration could play a role in better utilizing the battery asset or extending the life of a battery after its primary use in a vehicle. But either way, recycling is going to be an important step in the process. Oh. Can I get back to the slide, please? It seems I didn't, oh, here we go. Apologies for that. Okay. So there is often a comparison made, and I think a reasonable one between lead acid batteries and electric vehicle batteries. So today, over 70% of lead used in the United States comes from recycled sources. And well over 90%, over 99% in fact, of lead acid batteries that are sold in the United States today are recycled, which is a really promising outcome. But lead acid battery recycling operations have resulted in significant and persistent negative environmental impacts for local communities. For example, the former Exide battery recycling plant in Southeast Los Angeles, and persistent soil contamination issues there. It's critical that the future management practices for electric vehicle batteries address these issues and ensure that the burdens of end-of-life management are not disproportionately felt by vulnerable or disadvantaged communities who are at the front line. And it's important to note that electric vehicle batteries, lithium-ion electric vehicle batteries, while still considered a hazardous waste in California, contain far fewer hazardous materials and pose much lower toxicity risks compared to lead acid batteries. And so I think there's an opportunity there potentially to learn. Today's electric vehicle batteries rely on a small set of materials whose supply is constrained and could potentially be disrupted. Ensuring a durable supply of these critical energy minerals is important for achieving our electrification targets. In recognition of that, in 2019, the U.S. Department of Interior and in collaboration with the Department of Energy, released a list of 35 minerals with the potential for scarcity that were deemed critical to the national security of the United States. And in addition to platinum group metals, which are used in catalytic converters here in the bottom row, and rare earth elements, which are important for a number of renewable technologies, including permanent magnets. That list of critical minerals included 7 of the main elements used to create battery electrodes, the electrodes in lithium-ion batteries. So the rate of extraction of battery critical minerals has been increasing rapidly and is expected to grow, continued growth over the next 10 years. At current rates of extraction, there are less than 50 years of primary or virgin cobalt remaining in identified reserves. And this compares with a supply of nearly 100 years from a decade ago. This is illustrated on the figure, which shows mineral commodity data from the United States Geological Survey. In the figure, the horizontal axis is showing the largest single deposit of a mineral as a percentage of global reserves. This is a metric known as geographic concentration. And on the right axis, or the vertical axis, apologies, we can see the remaining years of a reserve supply given current levels of production, which is also known as the static depletion rate. So we can observe in the figure that over the last 10 years, the rate of exhaustion for these critical minerals has increased, in particular for lithium, and quite dramatically. The highly concentrated nature of cobalt and lithium reserves could also put pressure on battery supply chains over the long term. Today, the supply of retired batteries, the number of batteries that are coming off the road is relatively low. But that rate of retirements is likely to ramp quickly with increasing rates of adoption both across light duty and medium and heavy duty vehicle applications. And emerging research suggests that if regional recycling systems are developed, that by 2040 and moving forward, more than half of the US material demand for lithium-ion EV batteries could be met with recycled sources. Now, obviously, the US represents just a share of global demand for these materials, but it's highly likely that we will see a regional, or we expect regional supply chains to develop for manufacturing of these systems. Ensuring 100% of electric vehicle batteries that are sold in the state are recycled at their end of life is going to provide a key source of future battery materials. And over the long term, it's also critical to increase the recycled material content of electric vehicle batteries. Today's batteries rely on a diverse set of lithium chemistries, and sorting retired batteries by cathode chemistry could be a promising method for concentrating valuable materials, like cobalt, as well as reducing the need for additional refining before building batteries, constructing batteries from recycled materials. In order to reduce barriers to current and future recycling operations and enable sorting, tracking, and reuse and promote responsible design, it's clear that critical information on the battery needs to be included with the battery system throughout the value chain. And we think a battery label is an effective mechanism to potentially address some of these issues. So the concept for the proposed label would contain 4 key pieces of information. The cell cathode chemistry, which would be some set of standard abbreviations of the key transition metals in the cathode, and provide information to recyclers and other stakeholders in the end of life or logistics value chain. The label would also contain information on the capacity performance of the battery system, which would build upon the state of health and durability requirements discussed previously and provide the rated cycles and output on a standard test cycle. The label information would also include the composition and voltage of the system or module, as far as the module and components of the power system. And a key piece of the label would also be a digital identifier, which would be a QR code that could be linked to a digital repository of digital information, including additional safety information on the specific battery. And the physical label illustrated would be linked to this digital identifier to create a forward-looking system for providing key information to stakeholders in the battery end-of-life management. So the content of the label that we've outlined that we're proposing today aligns with several existing or proposed standards for electric vehicle batteries. This includes both the proposed European Union directive, as well as China's rules on governing the transport of hazardous substances, and as well the SAE 2936 electrochemical standards label through the Society of Automotive Engineers. And you can see, we illustrate here in this table that information about the manufacturer, chemistry, performance and capacity, and composition are relatively standard elements of labeling campaigns that have been proposed or are existing. So in addition to this labeling proposal, CARB staff are evaluating additional concepts. CARB staff are continuing to actively engage with other state agencies to develop additional policy concepts and identify actions to support sustainable end-of-life battery management, recycling, and reuse. This includes participation in the ongoing lithium battery car recycling advisory group that's being led by CalRecycle and the Department of Toxic Subcontrol, and as well participation in a multi-agency report on battery end-of-life and photovoltaic end-of-life that we hope will be released later this year. CARB staff also plan to participate in the SAE working group on this for this new SAE standard setting process for battery labeling that will be revised. And thank you for your time. That concludes my section or my slides.
All right, thanks, Hanji. So we'll just do one last poll here and then get into the questions. So, gotta share it. Okay, so this one is more focused on our community member audience here. So if you're still tuned in, you definitely get an award for endurance here. So you can just respond while we start our questions. Shobna?
Okay. While you guys are doing the poll, I'm going to start off with our first question. Are you considering imposing battery recycling obligations on EV manufacturers, including requiring battery products to be standardized for ease of disassembly and establish tracing systems for components? I'll let Mike take that one. The answer is no, but Mike, do you want to elaborate?
Sorry, I'm still muted. I'm not sure what to, we think that the label is our first step, right? That's sort of incremental first step, where other things can be on the table, and that's why we're trying to stay involved with other California state agencies that are in this space, as well as other entities that are looking at this. So I think at the starting point, we've met with recyclers. There didn't seem to be at this point a consensus about moving to some sort of easier to disassemble or built for disassemble sort of battery product yet. I think actually the repurposing and rebuilding sector might be the one that would be better needing something like that. So it is something we're trying to talk to some battery reconditioners about and think about that kind of stuff. But at this, we don't have anything on track right now to propose in this rulemaking that would be something like that, designed for better disassembly and or so it's not off the table. It's just something that our first step is probably not in this first proposal.
Yeah, and this is a related question, Mike. Does CARB have authority over battery recycling, reuse, or other end-of-life issues? Isn't this within the jurisdiction of DTSC and CalRecycle, would CARB requirements overlap with these agency requirements?
That's why we are definitely actively involved in discussions with them. Hanji is our lead on some of our sort of work groups and stuff like that, as well as on this labeling requirement. So I personally can't speak to where the things start and end in terms of authority. But we're looking at labeling requirement. We already have labeling requirements on vehicles, so I think this one is an easy one for us to require within our authority. And I said we are talking to the other agencies to figure out, make sure that we don't get sideways with anybody, and that we're all working towards the common goal, especially since we have such clear direction from the top down in California to transition to a 100% electrified fleet, and we know that reuse and recycling has to be a key part of that.
Okay, Hanji, I have a couple of questions here for you. So EV batteries typically use class 1 nickel. Steel uses class 2 nickel. Does your analysis differentiate between these two nickel types?
Yeah, actually, that's the good question, that there is some differentiation within these mineral classes, particularly nickel, which has some diverse supply. Yeah, we've looked on the supply side, particularly on the USGS data I showed you, that was just reserves. So that does not look at the grades. But in the recycling estimates paper that I referenced, we did look specifically at production capacity and of nickel by grade.
Okay, another question for you, Hanji. These two are related, but I'll read the first one first. Joshua Gray from SGS. What is being done currently to prepare for these future recycling needs? How large is the current reconditioning market, and how large do you anticipate it to be in 5 years?
Well, it's a complicated question. As far as the current, I'm not exactly sure what reconditioning market is, but as far as reuse and second life, there is a relatively robust third-party second life sector emerging with some medium-sized players who probably sell or operate systems that are on the megawatt scale. I think that it's likely that we could see facilities that would utilize second life batteries that are on probably the gigawatt scale, but aren't probably going to be much larger than the comparable size of a large stationary facility. Maybe I misread the question as far as, is it recycling facilities versus reconditioning facilities? So perhaps if they want to provide some additional clarification on that.
Okay, and so go ahead, and if you want to provide or clarify your question, we can read it out again. The next question, can you provide insight on current lithium-ion EV battery recycling facilities in the U.S., and are you aware of any such facilities coming online in California?
There's no actual recycling facilities for lithium-ion batteries currently in the state. There are some pilot scale facilities that are being developed in the United States, in Nevada, Arizona, and New York, and Ohio. There are some pilot scale and demonstration facilities, as well as some other facilities that are being developed in North America. Currently, there are some companies which are based in California, which are working to develop some pieces of that logistics supply chain. So they are holding companies essentially, or processors, who have agreements with existing manufacturers to take and refurbish or to transport retired batteries to recyclers.
Okay, at this moment, that's all the questions we have that are posted in the questions boxes here. So again, if you guys have more questions, we will be one of the questions was about slides. We will be posting the slides on our website in the near future, so that you can go to our website and get those. They are posted right now as handouts, as a PDF, you know, in this GoToWebinar. And I'll pass it back to Belinda.
Okay, thanks, Shobna. So I'll just share the results of our last poll here. Yeah, there we go. So looks like a lot of people wanting some online presence here. And then maybe one day we'll even be back in person. So this is good feedback for helping us plan some future or community-based events. So I'm just now, let me hide this, and then I'm going to share our timeline. So wrapping up, here's the timeline until our board hearing, which we're anticipating will be June of next year. Given the broad scope of this rulemaking, there's just too much information to share and discuss in just one more workshop. So we are adding another workshop in the summer. Sorry, there we go. And some of the concepts that we're currently developing: how to increase access to ZEVs in priority communities, change test procedures for certifying all electric range of battery electric vehicles, and changes to how ZEV credits will be publicly reported in the future. And we'll also use that workshop to update everyone about the air conditioning refrigerant proposals that we shared at our last workshop, and then any progress that we've made on other proposals that we've shared either today or previously. And if you're wondering when we'll be unveiling new greenhouse gas fleet average standards, that's not part of this June 2022 rulemaking package. We're working closely with US EPA to ensure that both of our programs will be coordinated, and unfortunately that puts us on a separate regulatory timeline from this one. So we shared this information earlier, but wanted to remind everyone about the questions and the comments. So you can email those to us at cleancars@arb.ca.gov. And again, there was a lot of technical information presented. So if you'd like to discuss this rulemaking with us in more detail, please don't hesitate to reach out to us using that email as well. And then a final plug for subscribing to our email list, so that you're notified of future workshops and events and when documents are posted on our website. As you heard during the presentation, we're going to be posting all of the materials that we shared today, as well as a few additional materials in a couple weeks. So with that, I think we'll just wrap up even a few minutes early. And so we'll see you again this summer. Thanks, everybody. Oh, actually, that looks like maybe there's a question. So let's just give people.
Did you circulate contact information on speakers is one of the questions. And I'll say, I think the two handouts we had for medium duty vehicles and EVAP, we did have you know, presenters on there, but maybe that's something we can also provide when we post our slides.
Yeah, and there's also a request for the link for the email list. Actually, I think in the follow-up email that you'll receive tomorrow as like a thank you, we did add that link in there. And then if you downloaded the presentation, it's one of those early slides has a link or a hyperlink to the email list. So that's another way to subscribe. I'm sorry, not able to pull it up right now. There's a couple more questions.
Yeah, there's a question on, you know, with the final hearing in June 2022, will there be enough lead time for the regulation to address model year 2026? And I think Mike mentioned this earlier in the presentation that, you know, we'll be looking at each of the provisions to see when is the correct timeline. And hopefully, you know, we will have that for you either in the next workshop or definitely in our fall workshop. So we do think we can affect some of 2026 model year, depending on the provision. And then when do we anticipate releasing the proposal for the ZEV credit requirements for 2026 and beyond? And again, I think that's, and I don't know, Anna, if you want to take that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it'll continue to be developed depending on the kind of feedback that we get from this workshop and the follow-on conversations that come from this. So, you know, I expect to be able to update it in the summer and in the fall. But if you've ever been part of a rulemaking process before, this is an ongoing conversation throughout. So we will provide updates as we have them on what was proposed today and how they can be, your comments, the community comments can be incorporated into the proposal.
Yeah, and I just want to reiterate that we are early in the process here. This is, you know, these are staff proposals and then we have lots of slides in our presentation here that are asking for input. So we do expect to get a lot of input from stakeholders and come back to you, you know, looking at that input and, you know, revising our proposals as, you know, as the months go on here and we have other workshops. I think that's all the questions we have, Belinda. So,
all right. Well, that's a wrap then. Thank you again.
Thank you, everyone,
for participating, and we'll see you later. Maybe in person. Who knows?